Welcome, Night Seekers, to Netheric Horror. Tonight, true scary stories, soothing rain, and gentle narration. Relax, close your eyes, and let the nightmares begin. Subscribe, like, and comment if you dare. Sweet dreams, if you can. I spent about 3 years stationed in England during my time in the military, working inside a secure facility on base that most people never got anywhere near. During the day, the place was completely alive, with people moving in and out. A constant mix of military personnel, civilian contractors, and government employees, all coming and going to do their jobs. The building itself sat inside its own fenced compound, which was already inside the larger perimeter fence of the base. So you were looking at layers within layers of security before you ever got close to the front door. Even once you were standing right outside, getting in required passing through several more checkpoints inside the building itself. We also had our own dedicated entry control point, which everyone just called the ECP, manned around the clock, along with roving patrols who walked the grounds outside at set intervals throughout the day and night. The point I am trying to make before I even get into what happened is that this was not some loosely guarded office building. Getting into that facility without proper clearance was not a matter of finding an unlocked door or slipping past the distracted guard. You either had the badge that let the system recognize you, or you were not getting in at all, short of using explosives. And I mean that quite literally. At night, everything changed completely. During the day, the halls were full of chatter and footsteps and the hum of dozens of people working. But once the sun went down, the entire building emptied out until it was just the skeleton crew. Usually somewhere between 2 and 4 of us, covering the whole facility until morning. The roving patrols were still out there circling the grounds in the dark, but we rarely had any reason to speak with them directly, unless something was actually wrong. It is worth understanding just how large this facility really was. We are not talking about a small building with a couple of rooms. It sprawled out across a significant footprint, full of corridors, secure rooms, equipment bays, and storage areas, most of which sat completely dark and silent for the entire night shift. Working there overnight had its own particular atmosphere, the kind of quiet that presses in on you after a while, especially once you have spent enough hours listening to nothing but the hum of equipment and the occasional creak of a building settling around you. Part of our job on night shift involved monitoring a wall of screens showing live feeds from the security cameras positioned throughout the entire compound. There were far too many camera positions to display all at once, so the system was set up to cycle through them automatically, holding on each feed for roughly 10 seconds before flipping to the next one, and then the next, running through the full rotation over and over throughout the night. You would sit there watching this slow, repetitive cycle of empty hallways, empty equipment rooms, empty parking areas, empty stretches of fence line, hour after hour, feed after feed, the kind of monotonous visual rhythm that becomes almost hypnotic after a few hours on shift. On the particular night this happened, there were 3 of us working, myself included, spread out across the facility, handling our various responsibilities. At some point, well after midnight, a call came through from the SCP letting us know they had motion alarms triggering in one of the equipment rooms elsewhere in the building. Whenever something like that happened, someone had to physically go check it out, walk over, inspect the space, and confirm whether it was an actual problem or just a false alarm from a faulty sensor, which did happen from time to time, given how old some of the equipment in that place was. My supervisor made the call, and being the lucky one that night, he sent me to go check it out. I made my way through the quiet, empty corridors toward the equipment room in question, my footsteps the only sound echoing off the walls in that particular stretch of hallway. When I got there and stepped inside, there was absolutely nothing out of place. No sign of anyone, no sign of forced entry, Nothing knocked over. Nothing that would explain the motion sensors going off. I picked up the internal phone mounted on the wall in there, the kind hardwired directly into our internal system, and called back over to my supervisor on the main operations floor to let him know everything looked clear. Nothing to report. After that call, I picked the phone back up and rang through to the SEP directly, mostly just to double-check whether they could actually see me on the live camera feed from where I was standing. Partly out of habit and partly just wanting a second confirmation that everything really was fine. The response I got back over that phone line is something that has stayed with me clearly ever since, word for word, in a way that very few conversations from that job ever have. The voice on the other end said quite plainly that they had two of me on the screen. Not one figure standing in that equipment room. Two, I remember standing there in that room, looking up at the small camera mounted near the ceiling, trying very hard to keep my voice level and casual even as my stomach dropped, and I asked them where exactly they were seeing this other person in relation to me. They told me, without any hesitation, that the second figure was positioned at about my 5 o'clock, just off to the side and slightly behind where I was standing. I asked them to describe what they were seeing. They told me they could not make out the face clearly, but that whoever it was appeared to be around 6 feet tall, dressed in BDUs, and built like someone who spent a serious amount of time in the gym, the kind of build you would describe as a lifter. I need to explain why that detail in particular hit me so hard in that moment. BDUs, the old-style battle dress uniform, had not been our standard uniform for roughly 4 years by that point. Nobody on base, nobody in our unit, nobody who had any legitimate reason to be inside that secure equipment room would have been wearing that uniform anymore. It had been phased out and replaced years earlier. Whoever this figure was that the ECP was describing, they were dressed in a uniform that should not have existed inside that building anymore, standing in a space that required badge access through multiple layers of security to even reach. I slowly turned around in the direction they had described, pointing toward the empty space just behind and to the side of me, and asked them directly if that was the spot. They confirmed it. That was exactly where they were seeing this second figure standing. And there was nothing there. No shadow, no shape, no person, nothing but empty equipment room and the low hum of machinery around me. I asked the SEP whether they had already relayed any of this to the main operations floor where my supervisor was stationed. They told me they had not yet done so, so I hung up the equipment room phone and called straight through to him myself. I told him to pull up the live feed from the equipment room camera and take a look for himself. There was a pause on the line, and then he said, in a tone of voice I had genuinely never heard from him before, asking who exactly that was standing next to me on the screen. At that point, whatever calm I had been holding on to completely evaporated. I was still fairly convinced, or at least trying very hard to convince myself, that this was some kind of elaborate joke my coworkers were pulling on me during a slow overnight shift. But something about the tone in my supervisor's voice, the genuine confusion and unease in it, made that explanation feel less and less believable by the second. I hung up the phone, turned around, and walked straight out of that equipment room, sealing the massive blast door behind me, a door that weighed somewhere around 2,000 pounds and was built to withstand exactly the kind of forced entry this facility was designed to prevent. I made my way back toward the main operations floor as quickly as I could manage, without breaking into a full run, though I will admit it was a close thing. By the time I got back through the door onto the ops floor, security forces personnel were already on site. My supervisor had called them in the moment he saw whatever it was he saw on that camera feed, without waiting for me to get back first. Even though I still half expected this whole thing to be revealed as some kind of prank at any moment, I found myself walking back down that same corridor toward the equipment room, this time trailing behind 3 armed security forces members with their rifles raised and ready, while I carried nothing more than a small folding multi-tool clipped to my belt, since I still needed to be there to badge them through the access points along the way. We reached the equipment room. I unlocked and reopened that heavy blast door, and the team moved in to clear the space properly, checking every corner, every piece of equipment large enough to conceal a person, every possible hiding spot in that room. They found nothing. No intruder, no evidence anyone had been there, nothing out of place beyond what I had already observed myself minutes earlier. While they were still in the process of clearing that room, the internal phone mounted on the wall started ringing. I answered it and was told that motion alarms were now triggering across multiple locations throughout the entire facility, not just the one equipment room where this had all started. And these were not areas with regular foot traffic overnight. These were sections that had already been fully checked, secured, and sealed for the night hours earlier. Spaces that should have had absolutely no reason to register any kind of movement at all. At that point, someone made the call to contact the main base command post directly and let them know we potentially had a serious security situation developing inside the facility. Security forces ended up spending close to another hour and a half systematically clearing the rest of the building, room by room, section by section, working through the entire footprint of that sprawling facility to rule out any possibility of an actual intruder somewhere inside. By this point, our commander and his full staff had already been notified and were actively tracking the situation as it unfolded, waiting on updates as the search continued. One detail that made the entire incident even harder to simply write off afterward was that the video recording system for that particular camera feed had not actually been capturing footage at the time, meaning we had no recorded video to go back and review once things had calmed down enough to try to make sense of what had happened. What we did have, however, was the testimony of 2 separate senior enlisted personnel, both experienced E7s with years of service behind them, who had each independently viewed that same live feed at different points, and both confirmed seeing exactly what I had already suspected from the ECP's description over the phone. Beyond their first-hand accounts, the motion detection system itself had recorded hard data, confirming something had genuinely triggered those alarms throughout the building. If it had only been 1 or 2 sensors acting up, that would have been easy enough to dismiss as a simple equipment malfunction, something we dealt with occasionally given the age of some of the wiring in that place. But this was over 30 individual alarms, spread across the entire facility, including several of the low-sensitivity detectors, the kind that require something genuinely large and heavy moving through the space to trigger them at all. Not the sort of thing a faulty wire or a small animal could easily set off. Each one of those sensors operated on its own separate hardwired circuit, running directly back to the ECP, with no shared network. Nothing digital or centralized that could have been compromised or glitched all at once. For that many individually wired, physically separate sensors to all register movement within roughly the same window of time meant something had genuinely been moving through that building, room after room, section after section, well after the facility had been sealed for the night. All of this unfolded, starting just after midnight, which meant the 3 of us working that shift ended up stuck inside that facility for several additional hours past when our replacement crew would normally have arrived to relieve us. Because of the scale of what had happened, we were required to sit down afterward and give a full debrief to our commander and his staff, walking them through the entire sequence of events from the initial motion alarm all the way through security forces clearing the building. By the time that debrief finally wrapped up, We were walking out of that facility somewhere between 2 and 3 hours after our standard 12-hour shift should have already ended, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the length of the shift itself. To this day, as far as I know, nobody involved in that incident has ever come up with an explanation for what actually happened inside that building that night. It gets filed away, unofficially at least, as one of those strange things that occurred on an otherwise unremarkable overnight shift, the kind of story that gets repeated quietly among people who were there, never quite explained, never quite resolved. There is one more detail about that night that did not fully register with me until much later, something that has stuck with me and honestly still makes the hair on my arms stand up whenever I think back on it. The camera systems installed throughout that facility were far from cheap or low-quality equipment. These were high-resolution cameras, good enough that you could make out someone's face clearly enough to practically count individual eyelashes from a distance of 40 feet or more. My own face had shown up perfectly clear on that feed the entire time I stood in that equipment room. But when it came to the second figure standing just off to my side, the one dressed in a uniform that had not been standard issue in years, both the ECP and my supervisor independently reported the exact same thing. They could see the shape of him clearly enough to describe his height, his build, the uniform he was wearing, right down to the specific style of BDUs. But neither of them, not once, across separate viewings on separate monitors, could make out anything resembling a face. This happened not long after I bought my first house, back in the spring of 2012. I had just closed on the place a few months earlier, and I was still in that phase of home ownership where everything feels a little new and a little exciting, where you are still walking around your own room, sometimes just marveling at the fact that you actually own walls and a roof now instead of renting someone else's. It was an older house, the kind with some real character to it. 2 full stories, the sort of place that had clearly seen a few decades of different families living inside it before I ever got the keys. I loved it immediately. I'd put a lot of work into making it feel like mine, picking out little things for the rooms, rearranging furniture, all the small domestic projects new homeowners throw themselves into. Around that same time, I had started dating again, doing the online thing through Match.com, which back in 2012 still felt like a fairly normal, unremarkable way to meet people, at least in my circle of friends. I had gone on a handful of dates with different guys that spring, some better than others, the usual mixed bag you get with online dating. But there was one guy in particular who I ended up seeing a few times in a row, enough that it had started to feel like something with actual potential. I genuinely do not remember his name anymore, which feels strange to admit given everything that happened, but that is just how much time has passed since then. The one detail about him that has stuck with me all these years, out of everything, is that he worked as a pet toy designer, which struck me as such a random, specific job that it somehow became the one fact about him my memory decided to hang on to long after his actual name slipped away. We had gone out a couple of times by this point. Dinner, drinks, that sort of thing. Nothing especially dramatic. Just 2 people getting to know each other the way you do in the early stages of dating someone new. On this particular occasion, he had come over to my place, and since it was still fairly new to me and I was proud of it, I decided to give him the full tour. Now, something important you need to understand about me, both then and now, is that I talk. A lot. I have never in my life met a silence I did not immediately feel the need to fill with words, and back in 2012, this tendency was, if anything, even more pronounced than it is today. So as I walked him through my house, room by room, I was chattering away nonstop about whatever came to mind. The history of the place, why I chose certain paint colors, some story about a piece of furniture, on and on. barely pausing for breath. Looking back on it now, with the benefit of hindsight and a good deal more self-awareness than I had at 20-something years old, I can see clearly that he was probably expecting the evening to go in a certain direction. We had been seeing each other for a little while at that point. He was getting the full house tour, and that tour had eventually led us upstairs and into my bedroom. All the normal signals were there, the kind that in retrospect seem completely obvious. But at the time, none of that crossed my mind even a little. I was too busy running my mouth about whatever random topic had captured my attention in that moment, completely oblivious to any romantic tension that might have been building on his end of things. So there we were, the two of us sitting on the edge of my bed, and I was still talking, still going on about something or other, when everything shifted all at once, so suddenly and so completely, that even now, all these years later, I can recall the exact physical sensation of it happening. I felt an incredibly sudden, sharp change in the energy coming off of him. 1 second, everything felt like a normal, slightly awkward but pleasant date, and the next second, it felt like the temperature in the room had dropped and something had gone genuinely wrong. I felt, with a certainty that did not come from anything he had said or done, that I was in danger, that whatever was happening in that moment was leading somewhere bad, that he meant to hurt me. I want to be clear that nothing about his behavior up to that exact second had given me any reason to think this. He had not said anything threatening, had not moved aggressively, had not done a single thing that would normally trigger that kind of visceral alarm in a person. And yet the feeling hit me like a wave, undeniable, and I froze completely. I did not know what to do, did not know how to react, but some deep, old part of my brain was absolutely convinced that I had every reason to be afraid, even without being able to point to a single concrete cause. And then, in the span of what felt like a single heartbeat, several things happened at once, stacked on top of each other so quickly it was almost impossible to process them individually as they occurred. One of my cats, who had apparently been curled up underneath my bed the entire time, without either of us noticing, came shooting out from underneath it like she had been launched. Her tail puffed up to nearly twice its normal size, hissing in a way I had genuinely never heard her hiss before. Not at strangers, not at the vacuum cleaner, not at anything. She bolted straight out of my bedroom and disappeared down the hallway, clearly reacting to something that neither of us could see, but that had apparently terrified her completely. At the exact same moment, a massive gust of wind came tearing in through my open windows. It was late spring, warm enough that I had opened a couple of windows upstairs to get some fresh air moving through the house, though of course I had kept the screens in place, being a reasonably sensible new homeowner. This was not a gentle spring breeze. This was a sudden, forceful blast of wind strong enough to send a stack of papers sitting on top of my dresser scattering across the room, some of them flying clear across to the other side, which even in the moment struck me as strange, since it had been a completely still, calm evening up until that exact second. And then, layered right on top of the cat bolting and the wind gusting through the windows, there was a loud bang from somewhere downstairs. Not a subtle sound, not something I could later convince myself I had imagined or misheard. A genuine, solid bang, the kind of sound that makes your whole body flinch. And immediately following that bang, I heard footsteps, heavy ones, the unmistakable sound of someone in large, solid boots, the kind of footfall you associate with a big man's weight, coming up my staircase at speed. Not sneaking, not creeping, running, hard and fast, taking the stairs 2 at a time from the sound of it. I heard those footsteps hit the top of the stairs, cross the landing, and come directly toward my bedroom, moving with total purpose. like whoever or whatever it was knew exactly where it was headed and had every intention of getting there as quickly as possible. The footsteps stopped, abruptly, right at my bedroom door. My door was open the entire time, nothing blocking the view into the hallway. And there was nobody there. No one standing in the doorway, no one on the landing. Nothing. The footsteps had been so loud, so clearly the sound of a large person moving with real weight and real speed, that there should have been someone standing right in front of us in that doorway when they stopped. There was simply empty air. The guy I was with reacted instantly. He practically launched himself off my bed, on his feet in a single motion, looking wildly around the room with this expression of pure confusion and fear, saying something along the lines of, "What the hell? What the hell?" over and over, glancing toward the door, toward the window, back at me, like he was trying to figure out where the threat was coming from, so he could deal with it. And honestly, in that moment, I felt exactly the same way. Whatever had just happened, all of it, the cat, the wind, the bang, the footsteps stopping at an empty doorway, none of it made a shred of sense. And my body was flooded with the same confused, electric fear his clearly was. He did not stay long enough for either of us to try and figure it out together. Within what felt like seconds, he was saying something about me having some kind of bad energy in my house. Something to that effect. The words themselves are a little fuzzy in my memory at this point. And then he was gone, moving quickly down the stairs and out my front door. I never saw him again after that night. He did not call, did not text, nothing. Whatever had been building between us over those few dates evaporated completely in the space of about 10 seconds, replaced by whatever it was that had just happened in my bedroom. I sat there for a long while after he left, still processing everything, running through it over and over, trying to find some rational explanation that would tie all those pieces together into something ordinary. I wanted very badly to believe there was a simple answer. Maybe a door downstairs had blown open on its own from the same gust of wind that hit my dresser, which could maybe, possibly, account for the bang if I stretched the explanation far enough. Maybe the footsteps were some trick of sound traveling through an old house with strange acoustics. Maybe pipes. Maybe the house settling in a particularly dramatic way that just happened to sound exactly like heavy boots on a staircase. Maybe my cat had just spooked herself over something completely unrelated, and the timing was pure coincidence. I tried on every rational explanation I could think of, one after another, and none of them held together, especially not when I tried to explain how a door blowing open downstairs could somehow also produce the distinct sound of footsteps climbing an entire staircase, crossing a landing, and coming to a stop directly outside my bedroom door, in perfect sequence, with a cat bolting in terror and a burst of wind strong enough to scatter papers across a room, all happening in the same handful of seconds. To this day, I genuinely have no explanation for what happened in my house that night. I have lived in that house for years since then, and while there have been a handful of other small, strange moments here and there over time, nothing has ever come close to matching the intensity of that particular night, the sheer stacked weirdness of every single element hitting all at once like that. I have half joked with friends over the years that my house apparently has its own resident ghost, and that whatever or whoever it is clearly did not appreciate the direction that date was heading, and decided to step in and put a stop to it before things went any further. I say it as a joke, because that is easier than sitting with how genuinely unsettling the whole thing still feels whenever I actually think back through it in detail. But joke or not, I have never forgotten the feeling of that sudden, sourceless dread washing over me right before everything happened, the certainty that something was wrong, followed immediately by my cat fleeing in terror. The wind tearing through my windows, that loud bang from downstairs, and those heavy, deliberate footsteps climbing the stairs and stopping right outside an open door with absolutely no one standing there. Whatever it was, wherever it came from, I have to give credit where it is due. That night, my house's ghost, if that is even the right word for it, showed up at exactly the right moment, made its presence unmistakably known, and made sure that whatever might have happened next in my bedroom that evening never had the chance to happen at all. I do not know if I believe in ghosts in any kind of formal, philosophical sense, but I know what I felt, I know what my cat felt, and I know that a grown man ran out of my house convinced my home itself was somehow dangerous. Some things you just cannot explain away. No matter how many times you try to talk yourself into a rational answer, and this is one of those things I have simply learned to live with, unresolved, sitting quietly in the back of my mind, right alongside all the other stories I have collected from that same house over the years since. This particular story actually happened before the last one I told you, back in 2010, though the order does not really matter much since each of these stands on its own. That year was, without question, one of the hardest stretches of my entire life. I had just gone through a breakup with a guy I had been completely head over heels for, the kind of relationship that ends and leaves you feeling like the floor has been pulled out from under you. On top of that, my living situation at home with my family had turned genuinely toxic. The kind of environment that wears a person down day after day until there is nothing left in the tank. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, everything came to a head and I ended up spending time in a psychiatric ward for the first time in my life, dealing with some very dark thoughts I had been struggling with. It was, all around, a period of my life defined by feeling completely unmoored, like I had lost every piece of solid ground I used to stand on. In the middle of all that chaos, my friend Jane did something for me that I will never forget as long as I live. She offered to let me come stay with her in her apartment for a while. No strings attached, just an open door and a place to land while I tried to put myself back together. Looking back now, with the distance of years between me and that version of myself, I understand just how enormous a kindness that really was. Taking someone in during the worst period of their life, someone who is struggling in ways that are messy and unpredictable and exhausting to be around, is not a small thing to offer. Jane did it without hesitation, and she did it with real care behind it too. She set up a proper little space for me in the corner of her living room, an air mattress made up with blankets and pillows, and she even found one of those folding privacy screens, the decorative kind that unfolds into panels, and positioned it around my little corner so I would have some semblance of my own space, some small sense of privacy even while sleeping in her living room. It was such a thoughtful touch, the kind of detail that told me she had actually put real thought into making me feel welcome, rather than just tolerate it. Jane had a dog, a little Jack Russell Terrier named Vinny, full of the kind of relentless energy that particular breed is famous for. Vinny took to hanging around my little corner of the living room almost immediately, curling up near my air mattress most nights, keeping me company in that quiet, uncomplicated way dogs have of simply being present with you without needing anything in return. During a time when I felt profoundly alone in almost every other part of my life, having that little dog choose to stay close to me each night meant more than I think I even realized at the time. One night, not too long after I had settled into this new temporary living arrangement, I had one of the most horrific nightmares I have ever experienced in my life. In the dream, I was being dragged down a hallway by my ankles, pulled backward at incredible speed by something I could not see. There was no visible force behind it, no shape, no figure, Nothing my dream mind could latch onto to explain what was happening. I just knew with the absolute certainty dreams sometimes carry that something was gripping my ankles and hauling me backward down that hallway with terrifying speed. I could not scream. I tried, over and over, and nothing would come out, my voice completely useless against whatever was happening to me. I could not grab onto anything either. No door frame, no piece of furniture, nothing within reach that might have let me stop my own momentum or fight back against the pull. The speed of it was almost blinding, faster than anything should reasonably move, faster than being dragged by another person could possibly account for. And in the middle of this nightmare, something strange happened within the dream itself. I remember, with total clarity even now, thinking to myself, in that exact moment of being dragged, that I used to have this same nightmare as a child. I remembered, inside the dream, how terrifying that recurring childhood nightmare used to be, and how many times as a little girl I would wake up from it, only to find myself somehow on the floor of my parents' bedroom, having apparently gotten up in my sleep and made my way there without ever fully waking, as though some part of me, even as a child, had been trying to run toward safety, toward the people who were supposed to protect me. In the middle of that same terrifying dream, recognizing the nightmare for what it was, even while still trapped inside it as an adult, I started desperately trying to wake myself up, fighting against the dream with everything I had. The way you sometimes can when you become just barely aware enough that you are dreaming to try and force your way back to consciousness. I bolted awake suddenly, sitting bolt upright on that air mattress, gasping for air, completely out of breath as though I had actually been running or actually been dragged, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. My first coherent thought, even through the fog of having just woken from something so intense, was hoping desperately that I had not been loud enough to wake Jane down the hall, not wanting to disturb her or worry her over what had just happened to me. It was in that same moment, still catching my breath, still trying to steady myself after the nightmare, that I noticed Vinny. He was right there on the air mattress with me. But he was not looking at me, not seeking comfort or attention the way he normally did. His back was turned to me completely, his whole body facing outward toward the dark hallway that led further into the apartment. The same kind of hallway I had just been dragged down in my nightmare-only moments before. His hackles were standing straight up along his spine, every hair raised, his small body tense and coiled in a way I had never seen from him before. He was growling, low and steady and loud, a sound far more serious than any bark or growl I had heard out of him up to that point, and he was shaking, his whole small frame trembling, fixated entirely on that dark hallway, as though he were watching something moving through it. That I simply could not see. I sat there for a long while after that, unable to fall back asleep, watching Vinny watch the hallway, my own heart still racing from the nightmare, unsure exactly what to make of the fact that my dog appeared to be reacting with genuine, visible fear to something in the same direction my dream had been dragging me toward only moments earlier. Eventually, sometime near dawn, Vinny's posture softened, his hackles went down, and he curled back up near me as though whatever had held his attention had finally passed. And only then did I manage to drift into something resembling actual sleep for the remaining hour or two before morning. The next day, once Jane was up and moving around the kitchen making coffee, I told her about the nightmare, describing it in as much detail as I could remember. The hallway, the sensation of being dragged by my ankles, the inability to scream or grab hold of anything, and then, almost as an afterthought, I mentioned Vinny's strange behavior afterward. The hackles, the growling, The way he had been staring so intently into the hallway like something was actually there. Jane stopped what she was doing completely. She set down whatever she had been holding, turned, and looked me dead in the eye with an expression I will never forget, somewhere between recognition and unease. She told me that her own mother had that exact same nightmare, the exact same one, every single time she came to stay at Jane's apartment, being dragged by the ankles down that same hallway, unable to scream, unable to grab hold of anything to stop it. And she told me that Vinny did the same thing for her mother, too, every time it happened, waking up beside her with his hackles raised, growling at that same dark hallway, watching something neither of them could see. I remember sitting there at Jane's kitchen table, coffee going cold in my hands, trying to process what she had just told me. It was not simply that I had experienced a frightening nightmare during an already difficult period of my life, which on its own would have been easy enough to write off as ordinary stress manifesting in my sleep, given everything I was going through at the time. It was the fact that this specific nightmare, this exact sequence of being dragged by the ankles down that particular hallway, unable to scream, unable to grab hold of anything, had also happened to someone else entirely. Someone with no connection to me, no knowledge of my own childhood nightmares. Someone who simply happened to sleep in that same apartment from time to time. And it was the fact that Vinny, this same small dog, reacted the exact same way each time it happened. Hackles raised, growling at that same stretch of hallway, as though standing guard against something that returned again and again to that specific space, targeting whoever happened to be sleeping there at the time. I never experienced that particular nightmare again during the rest of the time I stayed with Jane, though I remained there for several more weeks while I worked on getting my own life back to some kind of stable footing. I often wondered during the nights that followed whether whatever had been in that hallway might come back. And I found myself, more than once, glancing toward that same dark stretch of hallway before falling asleep, half expecting to see Vinny's hackles rise again, half dreading it, half almost wanting some kind of explanation to present itself so I would finally understand what it was that seemed to live in that apartment's hallway, waiting for the right person to visit before making its presence known. Jane and I have talked about that night many times over the years since, and neither of us has ever come up with anything resembling a satisfying explanation. She still lives in that same building today, and as far as I know, she has never experienced that particular nightmare herself, despite having lived there the entire time. It seems to reserve itself specifically for guests, for people passing through, people like me during one of the hardest chapters of my life, and people like her own mother, visiting from out of town. Whatever it is, whatever lives in that hallway or passes through it from time to time, it seems to have a very particular taste in who it chooses to visit. And Vinny, bless his heart, seemed to understand exactly what was happening every single time, standing his small, fearless ground against something the rest of us could never quite see, growling into the dark on behalf of whoever happened to be sleeping in that corner of the living room that particular night. Back in 2010, I was living through what was probably the hardest year of my entire life up to that point. I had just come out of a breakup with someone I had been completely in love with, the kind of split that leaves you feeling hollowed out for weeks afterward. At the same time, things at home with my family had turned genuinely toxic, the kind of daily environment that slowly grinds a person down until they have nothing left to give. All of that pressure eventually came to a head, and I ended up spending time in a psychiatric ward for the first time in my life, working through some very dark thoughts that had built up over that period. It was a year defined by feeling completely unsteady, like every piece of solid ground I usually relied on had been pulled out from under me all at once. In the middle of that mess, my friend Jane stepped in and did something I have never forgotten. She offered to let me stay with her in her apartment for a while. No conditions attached, just an open door during a time when I badly needed one. Thinking back on it now, from a distance of many years, I recognize just how significant a gesture that really was. Taking in a friend who is struggling in messy, unpredictable ways is not something everyone is willing or able to do. But Jane did it without a second thought, and she put real care into it besides. She set up a proper little sleeping area for me in the corner of her living room, an air mattress with blankets and pillows, and even found one of those folding privacy screens to give me a small sense of my own space. A little bit of privacy, even while technically sleeping in her main living area. It was such a thoughtful detail. The kind that told me she genuinely wanted me to feel at home, rather than like an inconvenience she was tolerating. Jane had a Jack Russell Terrier named Vinny, a dog with all the restless energy that breed is known for. Vinny took to spending time near my little corner almost right away, curling up close to my mattress most nights, keeping me quiet company the way dogs sometimes do, without needing anything from you in return. During a stretch of my life when I felt profoundly isolated in nearly every other way, having that small dog choose to stay near me each night mattered more than I probably realized at the time. Not long after moving in, I had one of the most horrifying nightmares of my entire life. In the dream, I was being dragged backward down a hallway by my ankles, pulled at incredible speed by something I could not see. There was no shape to it, no figure my dream mind could latch onto, just the absolute certainty that something had a grip on my ankles and was hauling me backward with terrifying force. I tried to scream, and nothing came out. I tried to grab hold of anything within reach, a door frame, a piece of furniture, and there was nothing to hold on to, nothing that could stop the momentum. The speed of it was almost too much to process, faster than being dragged by another person should ever feel. In the middle of that nightmare, something strange happened. I remember thinking, even while still trapped inside the dream, that I used to have this exact same nightmare as a child, and how terrified it used to make me. How I would wake up afterward on the floor of my parents' bedroom, having apparently gotten up and wandered there in my sleep without ever fully waking. Some part of me even back then trying to run toward safety in the middle of that same terror. Recognizing the nightmare for what it was, I started fighting to wake myself up, pushing against the dream as hard as I could. I woke up suddenly, sitting bolt upright on the air mattress, gasping for breath, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. My first thought, even through the disorientation of just waking up, was hoping I had not been loud enough to wake Jane down the hall. That was when I noticed Vinny. He was right there on the mattress with me, but he was not facing me at all. His back was turned toward me completely, his whole body angled toward the dark hallway leading further into the apartment, the same hallway I had just been dragged down in my nightmare-only moments before. His hackles were raised the entire length of his spine, every hair standing on end, his small body rigid and shaking. He was growling steadily, low and loud, a sound far more serious than anything I had heard from him before. Fixated entirely on that dark hallway, as though watching something move through it that I simply could not see. I sat there for a long time afterward, too shaken to fall back asleep, watching Vinny watch that hallway, unsure what to make of the fact that my dog seemed to be reacting to something in the exact direction my nightmare had just dragged me toward. Eventually, close to dawn, his hackles finally settled, and he curled back up beside me. And only then did I manage a little more sleep before morning came. The next day, once Jane was up making coffee, I told her everything. The nightmare, the hallway, the inability to scream or grab hold of anything, And then Vinny's reaction afterward. The hackles, the growling, the way he had stared so intently into that dark hallway. Jane stopped completely, set down what she was holding, and looked at me with an expression somewhere between recognition and unease. She told me her own mother had that exact same nightmare every single time she came to stay at Jane's apartment, being dragged by the ankles down that same hallway, unable to scream, unable to grab hold of anything. And she told me Vinny reacted the exact same way for her mother, too. Every time. Hackles up, growling at that same stretch of hallway, watching something neither of them could see. I sat there at that kitchen table with my coffee going cold, trying to process what she had just told me. It was not simply that I had experienced a terrifying nightmare during an already difficult stretch of my life, which alone would have been easy enough to explain away as ordinary stress. It was the fact that this specific nightmare, the ankles, the hallway, the inability to scream or grab hold of anything, had happened to someone else entirely. Someone with no knowledge of my own childhood nightmares. Someone who simply stayed in that same apartment from time to time. And it was the fact that this same small dog reacted the identical way each time, as though standing guard over whoever happened to be sleeping in that corner. I never had that particular nightmare again during the remaining weeks I stayed with Jane, though more than once I caught myself glancing toward that same dark hallway before falling asleep, half expecting Vinny's hackles to rise again, half dreading it. Jane and I have talked about that night many times since, and neither of us has ever landed on an explanation that satisfies either of us. She still lives in that same building today, and as far as I know, she has never had that nightmare herself, despite living there the whole time. Whatever it is that moves through that hallway seems to reserve itself for guests passing through. People like me during one of the hardest chapters of my life, and people like her own mother visiting from out of town. And Vinny, without fail, seemed to understand exactly what was happening every time, standing his small, fearless ground against something the rest of us could never see, growling into the dark on behalf of whoever happened to be sleeping in that corner that particular night. Now that I have laid out enough background to make it clear just how strange this particular property really was, I want to tell you about the wildest thing that ever happened to me while I boarded my horse there. Back then, I used to work at the barn every single Sunday as a way of paying down part of my boarding costs. The job was simple enough on paper. I cleaned stalls, filled water buckets, brought the horses in from the pasture so they could eat their grain, and then turned them back out again afterward, unless the weather happened to be bad enough to keep them inside for the night. It was a 24-hour turnout facility, meaning the horses lived outside in the pastures around the clock as their normal way of life, only coming into the barn itself to eat, and occasionally to shelter from especially rough weather. The property itself sat back off the main road, down a long gravel driveway lined with old fencing that had clearly been repaired and patched many times over the years, the wood gone gray and splintered in places from decades of weather, held together in a few spots with nothing more than baling wire and stubbornness. Beyond the pastures, thick woods bordered almost the entire perimeter of the place, the kind of dense tree line that swallowed light almost immediately once you got a few feet past the tree trunks nearest the fence. During the day, none of that felt particularly unusual. It was just a working horse property, a little rough around the edges the way most boarding barns tend to be, full of the ordinary sounds and smells you would expect, hay dust in the air, the occasional squabble between horses over who got which spot at the fence line, the low hum of a radio someone had left on in the tack room. But once evening chores rolled around and the light started fading, especially in the dead of winter when darkness came early and settled in heavy, the place took on a different feeling entirely. quieter in a way that always made the hair on my arms stand up just slightly, even on completely uneventful nights. Bringing the horses in each evening was usually about as routine as chores get. We would simply walk over and open the pasture gate, and the horses, knowing exactly what that meant, would take off running back toward the barn on their own, heading straight for their individual stalls where their grain was already waiting for them. It was a process I had done more times than I could count. Always the same rhythm, always the same result. But one particular night, sometime in January of either 2008 or 2009, I remember it was one of those 2 years, though I could not tell you for certain which, things went very differently. I walked out to bring the horses in, like always, and as I approached the first pasture, I noticed something was off right away. Instead of their usual loose scattering across the field, all the horses in that pasture were clumped tightly together, milling around near the gate in a way I had never seen them do before. It was immediately obvious that they were nervous, spooked by something, worked up in a way that went well beyond their normal evening restlessness. It was dark enough outside that seeing details should have been difficult, but somehow I could still make out the whites of their eyes on more than one of them, that wide, rolled-back look horses get when something has genuinely frightened them. And then, right in the second before I reached out to open that gate, I heard something coming from the tree line at the far back corner of the pasture. A sound I can only describe as something close to moo-woo-wah-ha-ha-ha, a kind of drawn-out, warbling shriek that immediately made my skin crawl. It sounded almost like laughter, but wrong somehow, like some exaggerated, cartoonish caricature of evil laughter rather than anything that should exist in the real world. I know how strange that description sounds even as I say it, but there is genuinely no better way I have ever found to put it into words. The moment that sound cut through the night air, every single horse in that pasture completely lost it. They bolted, all of them at once, tearing away from the gate and running flat out back toward the safety of the barn, clearly reacting to whatever had just made that sound with pure, unfiltered panic. I will admit, standing there alone in the dark, I was more than a little freaked out myself. My brain was scrambling to come up with any kind of explanation for what I had just heard, and coming up completely empty. Whatever that sound was, it did not match anything I had ever heard before. Not any animal call I recognized, not anything that made sense given where I was standing. I started jogging back up toward the barn myself at that point, wanting to get the stall doors shut behind the horses while they settled in to eat, moving quickly despite how unsettled I felt. When I got inside the barn, the first thing I saw was Hawk, one of the barn owner's own horses, running in tight, frantic circles inside his stall. He was completely lathered in sweat, clearly terrified, moving in a way I had genuinely never seen from him before. As I reached to pull his stall door shut, there was a sudden, loud bang against the outside wall of the barn, right against the section where his stall was located. And immediately after that bang, the same sound came again, that same drawn-out, warbling shriek of laughter, even louder this time, close enough that it felt like it was pressed right up against the barn wall itself. It was deafening in that moment, genuinely one of the loudest, strangest sounds I have ever heard in my life. And Hawk was whinnying by that point, adding his own frightened noise to the chaos. That detail scared me more than almost anything else that happened that night, because Hawk was never afraid of anything. If anything, he had a reputation around the barn as a bit of a troublemaker, the kind of horse who stirred up trouble just for the fun of it, completely unbothered by things that spooked other horses. Seeing him this genuinely terrified told me, more clearly than anything else could have, that something was very wrong. I felt awful about it, But at that point, I abandoned any pretense of finishing my usual routine calmly, and I ran straight to my car and got out of there as fast as I possibly could. My hands were shaking badly enough that it took me 2 or 3 tries to actually get my key into the ignition, and I remember glancing constantly at the rearview mirror and at the dark tree line beyond the parking area the entire time I was backing out, half convinced I would see something standing there, watching me leave. I want to be clear that by the time I left, every horse was safely inside its own stall, already eating, which was the one small comfort I held on to as I drove away, because I genuinely do not think I could have brought myself to stay outside in the dark with whatever that was still out there. The drive home that night felt endless, even though it was really only about 15 minutes along mostly empty back roads. I kept the radio off the entire way, some instinct telling me I needed to stay alert to any sound, even though logically I knew whatever had made that noise back at the barn had no way of following a car down a paved road. I drove faster than I probably should have, checking my mirrors far more often than usual, and I did not fully relax until I saw the lights of my own driveway ahead of me. Once I got home, I sent a text to my barn manager explaining everything that had happened. She and her husband lived in the house right there on the property, but the two of them had been out at dinner that particular night, so neither of them had been around to witness any of it firsthand. The next day, she texted me back asking if I would mind her sharing what happened with another boarder named Tina, who worked the barn chores on Saturdays the same way I did on Sundays. I told her absolutely, tell anyone she wanted, since at that point I honestly just wanted someone else to help me make sense of what I had experienced. I should mention something about Tina here, since it matters for what comes next. She was, by profession, an actual rocket scientist, an incredibly sharp, no-nonsense kind of person, and also, if I am being completely honest, someone with a reputation for being fairly difficult and unpleasant to deal with most of the time. She was not the type of person prone to dramatics or exaggeration, which is exactly why what happened next stuck with me the way it did. A couple of days after my own experience, Tina pulled me aside and asked if we could talk privately. She then told me that she herself had gone through the exact same thing I had the previous weekend, before my own encounter had even happened. As she told me this, tears started welling up in her eyes, and it was immediately obvious just how shaken she genuinely was. This conversation was happening in broad daylight, with several other people around at the barn that day, and yet her eyes kept darting back and forth nervously as she spoke, her movements jerky and tense, constantly glancing over her shoulder as though checking to make sure nothing was creeping up behind her even in the middle of the afternoon. It was clear, watching her, that whatever she had experienced had left a genuine mark on her. After that conversation, Tina stopped coming around the barn nearly as often as she used to. And, within a couple of weeks, she moved her horse to a different facility entirely. Whatever it was that had happened to both of us, something neither of us has ever been able to explain to this day, had scared her badly enough that she left the property altogether rather than risk experiencing it again. What struck me most, thinking back on that conversation with Tina in the months and years afterward, was just how out of character her reaction was for someone like her. She was the sort of person who prided herself on being unshakably rational, someone who worked professionally in a field built entirely on hard evidence and precise calculation, and who had very little patience for anyone else's superstitions or ghost stories around the barn. She was not someone who would have invented a story like that for attention, nor was she someone who would have easily admitted to being frightened of anything, let alone something she could not explain. The fact that she came to me privately, in tears, visibly shaken in broad daylight, surrounded by other people, told me more about the seriousness of what she had experienced than her actual words ever could have. The more I turned the whole thing over in my head afterward, the less any of it made sense. It had happened around 9 at night in the middle of January, a time of year when most wildlife should have been hunkered down, inactive, hibernating or otherwise laying low for the winter. If whatever made that sound had been running through the woods on foot, I should have heard something. Branches snapping, dead leaves crunching. The kind of noise that is unavoidable moving through underbrush that time of year, full of fallen branches and dry leaf litter that rustle loudly under any real weight. I heard nothing like that at all. No approach, no retreat, nothing except that sound appearing suddenly from the tree line, and then, moments later, somehow already at the barn itself. I have wondered whether it might have been some kind of owl, since certain owl calls can sound genuinely eerie under the right conditions, but in all the years since, I have never once found a recording or a clip of any owl anywhere that sounds anything remotely close to what I heard that night. I want very badly to believe there is some perfectly rational, natural explanation for all of it. And even now, all these years later, I still occasionally find myself searching online, trying to find something, anything, that might account for that sound. I have gone down countless rabbit holes over the years, listening to recordings of fox screams, bobcat calls, barred owls, great horned owls, even recordings people claim are mountain lions, trying to find anything that lines up even loosely with what I heard that night. Every single time, I come away disappointed, because none of them are quite right. Some come close in pitch. Others come close in that drawn-out, warbling quality, but none of them capture that specific, awful, laughing tone all at once, the way the real thing did. I have never found a single recording in all these years of searching that comes close. I remember clearly that when I finally got home that night, still rattled from everything, I changed my Facebook status to declare that I would punch every ghost I ever encountered directly in the face, which in hindsight was probably my brain's way of processing fear through humor rather than actually sitting with how unsettled I really felt. There is one more detail about that property worth mentioning, one that has always struck me as an unsettling footnote to everything else. Once the barn manager and her husband moved into that house on the property, his mental health took a severe and sudden downturn. He began drinking heavily, far more than he ever had before, and the two of them started fighting constantly. Their relationship clearly deteriorating under some kind of strain neither of them had experienced before moving there. Eventually, things reached a breaking point when she came home unexpectedly early one day and found him in the basement, in the middle of attempting to take his own life. After that, she left with him immediately, quitting her position at the barn and getting the two of them away from that property entirely, apparently unwilling to spend even one more night there once she understood just how badly things had spiraled while they lived in that house. I have never been able to connect that final piece of the story directly to the sound I heard that January night, or to whatever it was that Tina experienced the weekend before me, but I have also never quite been able to separate them completely in my mind either. Something about that property never sat right, not in the years I boarded there, and not in the years since, whenever I happen to think back on it. Whatever that sound was, wherever it came from, I know for certain that I heard it, that the horses heard it, and that at least one other person who had absolutely no reason to make up a story like that experienced the exact same terror I did, in the exact same place, only days apart. I ended up boarding at that property for a while longer after that night, mostly because moving a horse to a new barn is not exactly a simple or cheap decision. And part of me also stubbornly wanted to prove to myself that I was not going to let one unexplainable night chase me off. But I will admit that every single evening after that, bringing the horses in for their grain felt different. I found myself watching that same corner of the tree line more closely than I ever had before, listening a little harder for anything out of place. My body tensing up slightly every time the horses so much as flicked an ear toward the woods. Nothing quite like that ever happened to me again. Not with that same intensity, though there were a handful of other small, strange moments over the following months that I still cannot fully explain. Moments that on their own might have seemed like nothing much at all, but which felt different, heavier somehow, once stacked up against everything else that property had already shown me by that point. Other boarders who had been there far longer than I had would occasionally mention their own odd stories in passing. Little offhand comments dropped while grooming a horse or cleaning tack, the kind of thing people bring up almost casually, as though everyone simply accepted that the property had its quirks and left it at that without ever digging much deeper. Looking back, I wonder now how many of those offhand comments were people quietly downplaying their own version of what Tina and I went through, unwilling to make a bigger deal out of it than necessary. The same way I initially tried to laugh mine off with a joke about punching ghosts, rather than admit how genuinely rattled I was. Whatever lived out there in those dark, tangled woods, or simply passed through them from time to time, it clearly was not interested in making its presence obvious to everyone all at once. It seemed to prefer picking its moments carefully, and picking its witnesses just as carefully, leaving just enough of us shaken and unsettled to know deep down that it was real, without ever giving any single one of us anything solid enough to actually prove it to anyone else. This happened fairly recently, back in December. I had taken my wife and our 3 kids on a long road trip to visit my hometown. The kind of trip we try to make happen every so often to see family and let the kids spend some time in the place I grew up. It is not a short drive by any means. Several hours of highway broken up by the usual stops for snacks, bathroom breaks, and the occasional argument in the back seat about whose turn it was to pick the music. The ordinary chaos of traveling with young kids that every parent knows all too well. We had left later in the day than I originally planned, which in hindsight was the first small mistake in a chain of them that night, since it meant a good portion of our drive would end up happening well after dark. Winter in that part of the world brings a very particular kind of danger to the highways, a thick, heavy fog that rolls in overnight and gets so dense that the authorities simply shut the highways down around midnight until it clears enough the next morning to travel safely again. This is not an occasional inconvenience either. It happens reliably enough during the long winter months that most locals plan their travel around it without a second thought, timing long drives carefully to avoid being caught out on the road once that midnight closure kicks in. We had planned our drive without fully accounting for this, and sure enough, somewhere along the route, we got pulled off the highway along with a long line of other vehicles and diverted off toward the nearest exit. Everyone funneled off the main road at once because visibility had dropped to almost nothing. Now here is where I have to admit to making what I now recognize, with the full benefit of hindsight, as an incredibly foolish decision. Rather than simply finding somewhere safe to pull over and wait out the fog until morning, or backtracking to a town we had already passed through, I decided it would be a good idea to keep pushing forward through the backcountry roads. Relying entirely on Google Maps to guide us through unfamiliar territory I had absolutely no personal knowledge of, in conditions where I could barely see past the hood of my own car. Looking back, I think part of what drove that decision was simple stubbornness, a refusal to admit that turning back, or stopping, would mean losing hours we did not have, along with a naive confidence that a phone app could somehow substitute for actual local knowledge of roads I had never once driven in my life. I had my wife beside me and 3 kids in the back seat, and looking back on it now, I genuinely cannot believe I thought that was a reasonable call to make. I was, in every sense of the word, being a complete idiot driving my family through thick fog on unknown roads in the middle of the night because I did not want to sit still and wait. Things started feeling strange almost immediately once we left the exit and got onto those smaller back roads. We were crawling along at maybe 5 miles an hour. The fog was so dense that the headlights barely cut through more than a few feet ahead of the car, and there was not another soul in sight anywhere. No other cars, no lights from houses, nothing. I found myself hunched forward over the steering wheel, eyes locked on the little blue dot on my phone screen mounted to the dashboard, following Google Maps turn by turn, since there was genuinely no other way to know which direction to go in that soup of white nothingness surrounding us on every side. My knuckles going pale from how tightly I was gripping the wheel without even realizing it. The fog itself started doing something that I still cannot fully explain or shake from my memory. It kept rolling in and thinning out in these strange, uneven waves, sometimes clearing just enough to reveal a stretch of empty road ahead, and then thickening again almost instantly, swallowing the headlights whole. There was no wind that I could feel through the car vents or see moving anything else around us, no rustling in whatever vegetation lined the roadside. Nothing at all to explain why the fog itself would be shifting density so unevenly and so quickly right in front of our headlights. In certain spots, and I know exactly how this is going to sound, but I swear it genuinely felt like the fog itself was alive, moving with a kind of purpose or intention that regular weather just does not have. It did not drift the way fog normally drifts, gently and randomly with whatever breeze happens to be blowing. It felt like it was reacting to us somehow, thickening right as we approached certain stretches of road and thinning out again once we had passed through, almost like it was hurting us or watching us, though I know that sounds completely irrational to say out loud. More than once I found myself glancing at my wife just to see if she was noticing the same thing. And every time our eyes met in that dim glow from the dashboard, I could tell she was thinking exactly what I was thinking, even though neither of us said a word about it out loud at the time. We drove like this for what felt like an eternity, though when I actually think back on the timeline, it was probably close to an hour of this slow, tense crawl through the fog, my wife silent beside me. The kids thankfully asleep in the back seat, unaware of just how unsettled both of us had become in the front. At some point during that hour, we came across a particular stretch of road that has stuck with me more vividly than almost anything else from that entire night. The road ahead of us went completely pitch black on both sides, darker somehow than the rest of the drive had been up to that point, as though we had entered some section without any ambient light whatsoever, not even the faint diffuse glow the fog usually carried from whatever moonlight managed to filter through it elsewhere along the route. The fog itself began drifting overhead in thick, low bands, moving across the road at what felt like just above the height of the car. And then, seemingly out of nowhere, appearing almost instantly rather than gradually coming into view the way trees normally would as you approach them, I noticed a small cluster of trees on either side of the road, maybe 4 or 5 trees on each side, standing there, stark white, a shade of white I can only describe as looking like ash. I want to be clear that where I am from, we simply do not have trees that grow with bark or bare wood that color, nothing remotely close to that ghostly white shade, at least not that I have ever seen or heard of in my entire life living in this country. The way those trees appeared, framing that stretch of road on both sides, gave me an impression I have not been able to shake since, even now, months later. It looked, in that moment, exactly like something out of a movie, like one of those portal images you see in fantasy films, some kind of threshold or gateway framed by those unnaturally pale trees standing in perfect, deliberate rows on either side of the road, with the black emptiness beyond them and the fog rolling low overhead like a ceiling sealing the whole scene in. I remember my hands tightening on the steering wheel without any conscious decision to grip it harder, some instinct in me responding to that sight before my rational mind even had time to process what I was looking at. I slowed the car down even further, without meaning to, some part of me not wanting to get any closer to that stretch of road than I absolutely had to, even though there was no real alternative route available to us on the map, nothing but that single road stretching forward through the darkness. I remember thinking, in that split second as we approached, that I should just keep my eyes forward and drive through as quickly and calmly as I could manage, resisting the urge to slow down and stare at those trees the way some part of me desperately wanted to. There was something about the evenness of their spacing that bothered me more than almost anything else. The fact that they were positioned with what looked like deliberate symmetry rather than the random scattered way trees naturally grow along a roadside. It did not look like something that had simply grown there over decades. It looked arranged, almost staged, in a way that made the whole scene feel less like an unusual patch of forest and more like something constructed for a purpose I did not want to think too hard about while I still had to drive through it. What really confirmed for me that I was not simply exhausted and imagining things was my wife's reaction, sitting next to me. She has never been someone who gets into horror movies or ghost stories, the kind of person who watches those things purely to humor me and usually spends the whole time only half paying attention, unbothered by jump scares or spooky atmosphere the way I tend to be. But in that moment, driving through that stretch of road with those white trees on either side, she went completely silent and rigid in her seat. And when I glanced over at her, I could see genuine, unmistakable fear on her face. The kind of expression I had honestly never seen her wear during any of the horror movies or scary stories we had shared together over the years. Whatever she was feeling in that moment, it was not the mild, performative unease she usually shows me to be polite when I drag her into another one of my ghost story obsessions. This was real fear, and seeing that on her face somehow made the whole situation feel exponentially worse, because if she was genuinely spooked, then whatever we were both sensing was not just my own tired imagination running away with me. We kept driving, neither of us saying much of anything in that stretch, both of us just wanting to get past it and back onto some kind of road that felt normal again. The silence in the car thick enough that I could hear my own pulse in my ears over the low hum of the engine. Eventually, the fog thinned out enough, and the road widened, and we found our way back toward something resembling civilization. Other lights in the distance, signs of towns nearby, and the tight knot of tension in my chest slowly started to loosen the further we got from that particular stretch of road. It was only later, once we were safely back home and I started telling family and friends about the drive, sitting around my mother's kitchen table over coffee the first morning after we arrived, that I learned just how significant a risk we had unknowingly taken that night. That entire region, a stretch covering roughly 500 square kilometers around where we had been driving, has a well-known reputation in our country as one of the worst areas for highway crime. The kind of place known for robberies, carjackings, and violence against travelers unlucky enough to break down or get lost out there. Nearly everyone I told the story to reacted the same way, setting down their coffee cups and going quiet for a moment before responding, telling me how incredibly lucky we were to have made it through that stretch without encountering anyone at all, especially given the timing, driving through there at around 3 in the morning in the middle of December. A few people speculated that maybe that was exactly why we made it through without incident, that even the criminals who normally operated in that area probably assumed nobody would be foolish enough to attempt driving through there at that hour in that kind of fog. So perhaps the roads really were as empty of people, at least the living kind, as they appeared to be to us. But it was not just the highway crime reputation that gave me pause once I started looking into that area more after the fact. More than one person I spoke to, including some older relatives who know the region far better than I ever will, mentioned, almost in passing, that the same stretch of territory has long been associated with rumors of people practicing all sorts of dark, occult rituals out there, the kind of local folklore that gets passed down through generations. Stories about strange lights seen deep in the countryside at night, about places locals avoid after dark regardless of any actual crime statistics, about odd rites supposedly still carried out in secluded spots away from any main roads. One older uncle of mine, who has lived near that region his entire life, told me flatly that there were certain roads out that way that families in his generation simply never drove after dark, no matter the reason. A rule passed down from his own parents and grandparents before him, with no one ever bothering to explain exactly why, beyond a vague sense that it simply was not safe in ways that had nothing to do with ordinary crime. I do not know how much of that reputation is genuine folklore rooted in something real, and how much of it is simply the kind of story that accumulates around any sufficiently remote, crime-ridden stretch of countryside over the decades. But knowing that reputation now, and layering it on top of everything I actually experienced that night, the living fog, that impossible cluster of ash-white trees framing the road like some kind of threshold, my wife's genuine, unshakable fear, it all sits very differently in my mind than it would have if I had simply heard about the crime rate alone. I have thought about that drive constantly in the months since it happened, turning it over in my head, trying to find some rational explanation that accounts for everything. The strange behavior of the fog, the trees that should not exist anywhere in our country, my wife's uncharacteristic fear, all of it. I have not managed to land on anything that fully satisfies me. Fog is unpredictable, certainly, and it is entirely possible that exhaustion and stress, after hours of tense driving through unfamiliar roads in the middle of the night, played tricks on both our minds simultaneously, making an ordinary stretch of trees seem far stranger than it really was. I have even tried searching online a few times since, looking for anything about unusual white trees native to that region, some kind of rare local species I simply had never encountered before that might explain what we saw in purely natural terms. I have not found anything that matches. No species, no local name, nothing that anyone else online seems to have documented or photographed in that particular area. But I keep coming back to the fact that my wife, who has never once reacted with genuine fear to anything I have shown her related to ghosts or the supernatural, sat there beside me in that moment, looking more afraid than I have ever seen her. And that alone tells me something happened out there that neither exhaustion nor imagination alone can fully account for. We made it home safely in the end, and the kids never woke up through any of it, blissfully unaware of the entire ordeal their parents went through in the front seat while they slept soundly in the back. I have not driven through that particular stretch of back roads again since, and I do not intend to, fog closures or not. If there is ever a next time we make that same long drive to my hometown in winter, I will be finding somewhere safe to simply stop and wait out the fog until morning, no matter how long it takes, rather than risk crawling through that same stretch of countryside again in the dark, wondering the entire time whether the fog itself is watching us move through it, and whether those ash-white trees are waiting somewhere out there for us to pass through them once more. My wife and I have talked about that night more than a few times since it happened, usually late in the evening after the kids have gone to bed, the two of us going back over the same details again and again, trying to make sense of something that still refuses to make sense no matter how many times we replay it. She has told me more than once that she still does not fully understand why she reacted the way she did in that moment. Why something about those trees and that fog got under her skin so completely when nothing else ever has before. Not any film, not any story I have ever told her. All she can say, every time we talk about it, is that in that moment, driving through that stretch of road, she felt certain, in a way she cannot fully explain, that we were passing through somewhere we were not supposed to be, and that whatever was out there in that fog on either side of the car knew exactly that we had come through, even if it never showed itself any more clearly than it already had. When I was in 7th grade, I used to walk home from school every single day. The walk itself was about a mile, nothing too long or unusual for a kid my age at the time, and most days I had a small group of friends who walked that same route with me. We would talk about whatever 7th graders talk about, complain about homework, gossip about whoever was dating whoever that week. The ordinary noise that fills up an afternoon walk home when you are 12 or 13 years old, and the biggest thing on your mind is usually what you are going to do once you get home. It was a comfortable routine, the kind you fall into so completely that you stop even thinking of it as a choice. Just something that happened at the end of every school day. Rain or shine. The same faces. The same jokes. The same familiar stretch of sidewalk under your feet. On this particular day, for reasons I genuinely cannot even remember anymore, none of my usual friends were available to walk with me. Maybe they had after-school activities that day. Maybe they had already left. Maybe something else came up. But whatever the reason, I found myself setting out on that familiar mile-long walk completely alone for what I think was one of the very first times. I remember feeling a little bored by the prospect more than anything else, mildly annoyed that I would not have anyone to talk to on the walk, with absolutely no sense that this particular afternoon would be any different from the dozens of ordinary afternoons that had come before it. This was back in 2007, and I want to make sure that detail is understood clearly. Because, at that point in time, kids my age simply did not carry cell phones the way they do today. There was no phone in my pocket to call for help. No way to text my mom to let her know something felt wrong. No GPS tracking my location in case anything happened. If something went wrong on that walk, I was completely on my own until I either got home or found another adult to help me. I want to walk you through the route itself a little, because I think it matters for understanding just how ordinary and unremarkable everything felt right up until it suddenly was not. It was a residential route, mostly quiet streets lined with houses, sidewalks the whole way, the kind of neighborhood where you would see the occasional car pass by, maybe a neighbor out doing yard work. Nothing that ever struck me as dangerous or worth thinking twice about. There were a couple of stop signs along the way, a small park about a third of the way through the walk where younger kids sometimes played after school, and one stretch further along where the houses thinned out a bit and the yards got a little larger. More trees, more space between one property and the next. I had walked that same stretch of sidewalk more times than I could count by that point in the school year, whether with friends or occasionally on my own during the rare days when everyone else had somewhere else to be. Nothing about that day felt different at first. The weather was ordinary. The streets were quiet in the same way they always were in the middle of a school day afternoon. And I remember just walking along thinking about whatever 12-year-old thoughts were occupying my mind that particular day, completely unaware of what was about to happen. I had made it about halfway home, right around the point in the walk where the route passes through a stretch that always felt a little more isolated than the rest. Fewer houses directly along the sidewalk, more open space between them, when something shifted in me all at once. The hair on the back of my neck stood straight up, and I felt, with total certainty, that I was being watched. I do not know how to fully explain that feeling to someone who has never experienced it, but I imagine anyone who has felt it before knows exactly what I mean. It is not a vague unease. It is a very specific, very physical sensation, like your body knows something is wrong before your conscious mind has even had a chance to figure out why. I felt genuinely, immediately scared, my heart already starting to race before I had even confirmed there was anything to be afraid of. My pace slowing almost involuntarily as every nerve in my body seemed to sharpen all at once, straining to pick up on whatever it was that had triggered that sudden, overwhelming sense of being watched. I glanced behind me, and that was when I saw it. A red sedan, moving slowly along the road behind me, creeping up at a pace that was clearly, deliberately matched to my own walking speed rather than the normal flow of traffic. Cars do not drive that slowly on a quiet residential street unless they are looking for an address, or unless they are doing something else entirely. And even at 12 years old, some part of me understood immediately that this car was not looking for an address. The car pulled up alongside me and kept pace, staying right there next to me on the road as I continued walking along the sidewalk. I remember the distinct sound of the engine idling low right beside me, matching my footsteps almost exactly. Close enough that I could have reached out and touched the passenger door if I had wanted to, though touching that car was the very last thing on my mind. I could see there were two men inside. The man in the driver's seat looked to be around 40 years old, white, with an expression I could not quite read, but that I remember making me deeply uneasy just from a glance. Something flat and watchful about the way he stared straight ahead through the windshield, rather than looking at me directly. The man in the passenger seat looked younger, maybe his late 20s, Hispanic, and he was the one who leaned toward the open window and spoke to me first, his arm resting casually on the door as though this whole interaction were the most normal thing in the world. He asked me how old I was. I did not look at him. I did not answer. Every instinct I had, even without fully understanding why, told me not to engage, not to look, not to give him anything at all, and so I just kept walking, eyes fixed straight ahead, pretending as best I could that I had not even heard him, my whole body suddenly rigid with a fear I did not yet have a name for. He asked again. Same question. How old are you? His voice a little more insistent this time, an edge creeping into it that had not been there in his first attempt. I still did not look at him, did not respond, and I felt my own legs start moving faster almost without my permission, my body reacting on some level well before my mind had fully caught up to how frightened I actually was. Some deep instinct already calculating distance and escape routes, even as the rest of me was still trying to process what was happening. He asked me to look at him. I refused, kept my eyes forward, kept walking, faster now, my heart absolutely pounding in my chest at this point, every part of my body screaming at me to just keep moving, and never once turn around to give him the satisfaction of seeing my face. And then his tone changed completely, dropping into something cold and hard that I can still hear clearly in my memory all these years later. He said, and I remember these exact words because they have stayed with me ever since, "Fucking look at me and tell me how old you are." I was terrified at that point, more scared than I think I had ever been in my entire life up to that day. A fear so total it seemed to blot out every other thought I might otherwise have been having, leaving only the singular focus of putting one foot in front of the other as fast as I possibly could. I did not look at him. I did not respond. I just kept walking as fast as I possibly could without breaking into a full run, some part of me still clinging to the hope that if I just kept moving, if I just got far enough away, This would somehow resolve itself without anything worse happening. Then, he started screaming at me. "Get in the fucking car," he yelled, his voice suddenly loud and aggressive in a way that shattered whatever fragile control I had been holding on to up to that point. The sheer volume and rage in his voice, cutting through the quiet street like something physical. And in that same instant, I heard the sound of his door starting to open. That sound, more than anything else that had happened up to that point, is what broke through whatever frozen, careful composure I had been maintaining. I ran. I did not look back, did not check to see whether he had actually gotten out of the car, did not glance over my shoulder even once. I simply ran as fast as my legs could carry me, all the way home. Every single step feeling like it took forever, even though I know now it could only have been a couple of minutes at most. I remember my backpack bouncing hard against my back with every stride, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps, my legs burning in a way they never had during gym class, some part of my brain screaming at me the entire way not to slow down, not to stop, not even for a second, until I reached my own front door. To this day, I genuinely do not know why they did not continue coming after me. I have thought about that question more times than I can count over the years since. Maybe a passerby appeared somewhere nearby and spooked them into driving off before they could follow through on whatever they had intended. Maybe another car turned onto the street at just the right moment. Maybe they simply decided the risk of chasing down a screaming, running kid in broad daylight on a residential street was not worth it, calculating the odds of getting caught against whatever they were hoping to accomplish. I will never actually know the real answer, and I think that not knowing is part of what has made this memory stick with me so persistently over the years. This open, unresolved question of just how close I actually came to something far worse than a terrifying walk home from school. When I finally got home, shaking and out of breath, I told my mom everything that had happened, as clearly and completely as I could manage, while still catching my breath and trying not to fall apart completely in front of her. I remember standing in our kitchen, still gasping, the words tumbling out of me faster than I could really organize them into a coherent order. The red car, the two men, the questions about my age, the screaming, the door starting to open. I remember her reaction distinctly, and it is a part of this story that has stayed with me almost as much as the incident itself. She did not fully believe me, at least not right away, not in the sense of taking the full severity of what I was describing completely seriously in that first conversation. She asked me a few questions, gently but with a note of doubt in her voice, wondering aloud whether maybe I had misread the situation, whether the men might have simply been asking directions or making some harmless comment that had gotten twisted in my fear. I think, looking back on it now as an adult myself, that some of that reaction probably came from a place of her own fear, the instinctive parental impulse to minimize a threat that feels too frightening to fully absorb all at once. But even without fully believing every detail, she still told me she would start driving me to school and picking me up every single day going forward. No more walking alone, no more walking with friends either, if it meant even the possibility of being separated from the group. I have thought about that day countless times over the years since it happened, turning it over in my mind from every possible angle, imagining all the different ways that afternoon could have ended if things had gone even slightly differently. What if I had looked at him, even once, even just out of the instinctive impulse to respond when someone asks you a direct question? What if that door had actually opened all the way, and he had actually stepped out of that car before I managed to get my legs moving fast enough? What if there had not been whatever unknown factor, whatever passerby or moment of hesitation that made them decide not to pursue me any further? What if the street had been just slightly more isolated than it was? one house fewer, one less possibility of someone else being nearby to notice? I do not have answers to any of these questions, and I do not think I ever will. But I know that whatever combination of instinct and luck got me through that walk home safely that day, it is something I have never once taken for granted since. I am profoundly grateful, more than words can really capture, that nothing worse came of that experience, that I made it home safely, that whatever those two men intended that day never came to pass. But I also carry, even now, all these years later, this persistent, uncomfortable awareness of just how close I came that day to becoming a very different kind of statistic, to disappearing off that quiet residential sidewalk in the middle of an ordinary school day afternoon, in a stretch of neighborhood I had walked 100 times before without a single moment of concern. It is a strange thing to sit with, knowing that an entirely different version of that day was sitting right there, one single decision away, one slightly different reaction away, one missing passerby away from playing out in a way I genuinely do not want to imagine in any more detail than I already have over the years since it happened. I think about that stretch of sidewalk sometimes even now, when I happen to drive past that old neighborhood, and I still feel a small echo of that same instinctive unease creeping up the back of my neck whenever I pass that particular block. 12-year-old me had no way of knowing, walking out of school that afternoon without my usual group of friends, that I was about to have an experience that would stay lodged in my memory so vividly for the rest of my life. An experience that taught me, far too young, just how quickly an ordinary afternoon can turn into something you spend the rest of your life quietly grateful to have survived. That incident changed something in me that never fully went back to the way it was before. For years afterward, I found myself hyper-aware of any slow-moving car nearby, my whole body tensing up automatically any time a vehicle slowed down near me on a sidewalk, whether I was walking to a friend's house, waiting at a bus stop, or just standing outside a store. I would glance at license plates without even meaning to, memorize the color, and make of any car that lingered a little too long nearby, a habit that has never entirely left me even now as an adult, many decades removed from that single, ordinary afternoon that turned into something else entirely. I also became, without ever consciously deciding to, someone who is fiercely protective of the younger kids in my life, nieces, nephews, the children of close friends, always the one asking a few too many questions about how they get to and from school, whether they walk alone, whether anyone is actually keeping a close eye on them along the way. I know exactly where that instinct comes from, even if I do not always say so out loud when people gently tease me for being overly cautious. I have told this story to a handful of people over the years, and the reactions tend to fall into two very different categories. Some people react the way my mother initially did, a kind of instinctive skepticism, wondering aloud whether it could have been something more innocent that I simply misread through the lens of childhood fear. Others react with the same cold recognition I still feel myself whenever I think back on it, understanding immediately, without needing further convincing, exactly how close that day came to going a very different way entirely. I have stopped needing anyone else to fully validate the memory for me at this point in my life. I know what happened. I know what I heard, what I saw, and what I felt standing on that sidewalk, with a car creeping along beside me and a stranger demanding I get inside it. Whatever anyone else chooses to believe about it now, nearly 2 decades later, does not change one single thing about what that 12-year-old version of me actually lived through on an otherwise unremarkable walk home from school. I used to work as an order puller in a warehouse, spending my shifts moving through the aisles, pulling items to fill orders, The kind of physical, repetitive job that keeps you on your feet and moving almost the entire day. It was steady, demanding work, the kind where you clock in and spend hours crisscrossing long rows of shelving, pulling boxes and product to fill whatever orders had come through that day, then moving on to the next one without much of a break in between. I had come back to that job after a difficult stretch away from work, 9 months off dealing with cancer surgeries, chemotherapy, and radiation, and while I was grateful to be back on my feet and working again. My body was not quite the same as it had been before all of that treatment. Coming back after something like that is its own kind of adjustment, both physically and mentally, learning all over again what your body can and cannot handle after months spent focused entirely on getting through treatment rather than on physical labor. My knees and hips in particular had started giving me real trouble since coming back, aching in ways they never had before, making the long hours of walking and standing that the job required feel far more taxing than they used to, even on days when nothing else about the shift felt especially difficult. One day during my shift, I needed to use the restroom, and I made my way to the small ladies' room set aside for our department. It was a modest space, nothing fancy, tucked away near the break area, the kind of restroom you would expect in any working warehouse. Functional rather than comfortable, with plain tile and fluorescent lighting overhead that buzzed faintly the entire time you were in there. It had just 2 stalls inside. The first one, closest to the door, was a narrow standard stall, while the second one, set slightly behind and to the left of the first, was the wider, deeper handicapped stall, built with extra space for anyone who might need it. Given the trouble I had been having with my knees and hips since coming back to work, I had gotten into the habit of using that handicapped stall whenever it was available, since the extra room made it noticeably easier to sit down and get back up again without putting unnecessary strain on my joints. Something I had not fully appreciated the value of until my own body forced me to start thinking about it. On this particular occasion, I went into the handicapped stall, as I usually did, closed and latched the door behind me, and sat down. And it was while I was sitting there that something happened which I still cannot fully explain to this day, no matter how many times I have turned it over in my mind since. Out of the corner of my right eye, I caught a flicker of movement up near the top of the stall wall, the shared partition dividing the handicapped stall from the narrow one next to it. It looked, in that brief instant, like someone's head peeking over the top of the divider, positioned high enough that whoever it was would have needed to be standing on something to reach that height, since the partition itself was tall enough that no one could simply peer over it, standing flat-footed on the restroom floor. My peripheral vision caught the general shape of a head and a face, though it was out of focus, not clear or detailed, just enough of an impression to register as a person looking over at me from the neighboring stall. For a split second, my first thought was that it had to be a close friend and coworker of mine, someone I got along well with and who had a reputation for occasionally pulling silly, harmless pranks around the warehouse to lighten the mood during long shifts. My brain processed that flicker of movement and immediately assumed it was her, up to her usual antics, trying to startle me for a laugh while I was sitting in the stall. That assumption lasted for exactly as long as it took my head to snap upward and actually look directly at where that movement had been. There was no one there. The space above the partition was completely empty. Nothing but the plain top edge of the stall wall and the ceiling beyond it. No head, no face, no shape of any kind. Nothing that could account for what I had just seen out of the corner of my eye only a second earlier. My heart was already pounding by that point. That particular jolt of adrenaline that comes from being startled, combining with a growing, creeping confusion as I realized the explanation I had reached for was not going to hold up. I said my friend's name out loud, asking if anyone was there, half expecting her to pop her head back up laughing, ready to admit she had been messing with me. There was no answer, no sound at all, not even the shuffle of feet or the creak of the narrow stall door beside me. Nothing that would indicate another person was standing in that adjoining stall at all. I sat there for a moment, listening carefully, half convinced I would hear some telltale sign of someone trying to stay quiet and hold back laughter. But there was nothing, just silence, the fluorescent lights humming faintly overhead, the only sound in that small room. When I finished up and came out of the stall, I found the restroom completely empty. No one in the narrow stall beside me. No one standing anywhere in the small space. No one who could have possibly been the source of that head and face I thought I had seen peeking over the partition only minutes before. I checked, genuinely checked, looking around that small restroom for any explanation, any sign that someone had been there and slipped out quickly. But there was nothing. Just an empty ladies' room, exactly the way it should have looked the entire time. I tried to brush it off after that first incident, telling myself I had probably imagined it. That stress and fatigue and the general exhaustion of adjusting back to full work days after such a long medical leave had played some kind of trick on my mind. My body had been through so much that year, and I had already noticed how differently I processed small, startling moments since coming back to work. My nerves more frayed than they used to be. My patience for anything unusual much thinner. It was an easy enough explanation to reach for in the moment, one that let me finish my shift and go home without dwelling too much on something that felt too strange to take seriously, and for a while I mostly managed to convince myself of it, filing the whole thing away as a fluke not worth revisiting. But then it happened again, sometime later, under nearly identical circumstances. I was sitting in that same handicapped stall, telling myself things had gone back to normal, that the first time had just been an unfortunate combination of nerves and imagination. And once again, out of the corner of my eye, I caught that same flicker of movement near the top of the partition, that same vague impression of a head and an out-of-focus face peeking over from the direction of the narrow stall beside me. And once again, the moment I turned my head to look directly at it, there was nothing there. No explanation, no sound, no sign of anyone in the restroom with me at all. The second time honestly frightened me more than the first, because it removed any lingering comfort I had been holding on to that the first incident was simply a one-time fluke, a trick of exhaustion or stress that would never repeat itself. After that second time, I genuinely did not want to use that restroom again. And I especially did not want to use that handicapped stall, despite how much easier it made things for my knees and hips given everything my body had been through over the past year. I started making a point of using a different restroom elsewhere in the building whenever I could manage it, even if it meant walking a little further out of my way during a break, past additional aisles of shelving and further from my usual work area, just to avoid having to sit in that particular stall and risk experiencing that same unsettling flicker of movement again. It was an inconvenience, especially given my knees, but it felt like a trade I was more than willing to make at the time. I want to be clear that I never told anyone at work about what had happened to me during those two incidents, at least not right away. I was embarrassed by it, honestly, worried that it sounded exactly like the kind of overactive imagination story people roll their eyes at, especially given everything else going on with me that year. Still trying to prove to myself and to my coworkers that I was capable and steady enough to be back on the floor after such a long absence. I did not want to be the coworker known for claiming to see ghosts in the ladies' room, on top of already feeling like I had something to prove just by being back at work at all. So I kept it to myself for a long while, quietly avoiding that particular stall, telling myself I had simply had two strange, unexplainable moments and leaving it at that, never once expecting that anyone else at that warehouse had gone through anything remotely similar. It was only much later, after I had already left that job entirely and moved on to other work, that the full weight of what had happened to me really settled in. Because it turned out I was not the only one who had experienced something in that same restroom. I had assumed, for a long time, that whatever happened to me had been some strange, isolated incident. The kind of thing you eventually chalk up to stress or exhaustion and simply try to forget about. I was not prepared for how differently that assumption would look once other people started coming forward with stories of their own. My sister, who also worked at that warehouse, brought it up to me completely independently, without me ever having mentioned my own experience to her beforehand. She told me that she had gone through something almost identical while using that same restroom, swearing that she had seen someone standing on the toilet in the narrow stall next to her, peeking over the partition to look at her, only to find, just like I had, that no one was actually there when she checked. She described the person she thought she saw as looking like a young man with curly hair, a detail that struck me immediately since it was different from what I had assumed I was seeing during my own experience, when my first instinct had been to assume it was my friend rather than any specific stranger. Hearing her describe that same wave of confusion, that same instant of looking directly at the spot only to find it empty, brought back everything I had felt in that stall all over again, and it was strange to realize she had been carrying around her own version of that same unsettling memory the whole time, never having brought it up to me before that conversation. Not long after that conversation with my sister, another former coworker of mine, someone who still worked at the warehouse after I had left, also brought up a similar experience completely unprompted, mentioning it almost offhand during a conversation about something else entirely, before circling back to describe what had happened to her. This coworker described seeing the same thing, someone peeking over the partition from the narrow stall, and interestingly, this person's impression matched my own original assumption rather than my sister's description. Believing in the moment that it was the same friend of ours who had a reputation for playful pranks around the warehouse, only to find, once they looked directly at the spot, that there was no one there at all, and that friend was nowhere near that restroom at the time, confirmed later when she checked with her directly. Hearing these two separate accounts, completely independent of each other and independent of my own experience, gave me a genuine case of the heebie-jeebies that has stuck with me ever since. A chill that runs through me even now, just recounting it. 3 different people at different times using that same restroom, all reporting the same basic experience, a head or face appearing to peek over the partition between the 2 stalls, vanishing the instant anyone looked directly at it, with no explanation, no sound, and no sign of anyone else ever actually being present in that small restroom at the time. Each of us had a slightly different impression of who or what we thought we were seeing in that first split second before looking directly at it. My friend, a curly-haired young man, the same friend again from my former coworker, and yet the core experience itself was identical across all 3 accounts, right down to the smallest details. The flicker of movement, the peeking presence, the total absence of anyone there upon direct inspection, the same racing heart afterward. What makes the whole thing even stranger to me, now that I have had time to sit with it and think it over, is that this warehouse was a relatively new building, less than 10 years old at the time all of this was happening. It was not some old, decrepit structure with decades of history behind it. The kind of place you might expect to carry some lingering presence from tragedies or events that happened there long ago. The sort of building with a reputation that gets passed down through generations of employees. It had been built on what used to be farmland, open fields that had presumably been used for agriculture for who knows how many years before the warehouse itself was ever constructed. Standing out in that parking lot on a break some days, looking out past the edges of the property where the pavement gave way to overgrown grass and a distant tree line. It was not hard to imagine what that land might have looked like decades earlier. Rows of crops instead of rows of shelving, a farmhouse somewhere in the distance instead of a loading dock, and rows of parked delivery trucks. There was nothing in the building's own history, as far as I know, that would explain any kind of haunting or lingering presence tied specifically to the structure itself. No rumors among the staff about a death on site, no urban legend passed down about the warehouse before it became a warehouse. That fact has left me wondering, more than once, whether whatever we all experienced in that restroom had less to do with the warehouse building itself and more to do with whatever history existed on that land long before the warehouse was ever built. Farmland carries its own history, often stretching back generations. Families who lived and worked and sometimes died on that same ground long before any structure went up to replace the fields. I have no real way of knowing what, if anything, might have happened on that particular stretch of land in the decades or even centuries before it ever became a warehouse property. Whether it had passed through several different families over the years, whether anything difficult or tragic had ever unfolded there while it was still just open farmland, but it is hard not to wonder, especially given how consistently that same small restroom seemed to produce the exact same unsettling experience for multiple different people who had no reason to compare notes with each other or influence each other's accounts in any way. I have never found any kind of satisfying explanation for what happened to me in that restroom. Not for myself, and not for my sister or my former coworker either. I know what I saw, twice, in that same stall. And I know that I was far from the only person who experienced it. Whoever or whatever that presence was, peeking over the partition wall in that small ladies' room attached to a warehouse built on old converted farmland, it seemed to have a particular fondness for appearing just long enough to be glimpsed out of the corner of someone's eye and vanishing completely the instant anyone dared to look directly at it, leaving each of us with nothing but an empty restroom, a racing heart, and a story we were almost too embarrassed to share with anyone else. Until it turned out we were not the only ones carrying it. I think about it sometimes, even now, years after leaving that job behind, wondering how many other people who worked at that warehouse might have had their own version of the same experience, and simply never mentioned it to anyone, keeping it quietly to themselves the same way I did at first. It makes me wonder just how many stories like mine exist scattered across ordinary workplaces everywhere. Unremarkable buildings with nothing obviously haunted about their history, sitting quietly on top of land that carries its own older, unknown story, waiting patiently for the right combination of person and moment to bring whatever lingers there briefly into view, just long enough to be seen, and gone again before anyone can ever look at it directly. Oh, hear me out on this one, because I know exactly how it sounds. I was at this bar in the French Quarter called the Morgue, a place with a reputation for being genuinely creepy, the kind of bar that leans hard into a dark, gothic atmosphere with a name to match. The inside of the place is exactly what you would expect given that name: dim lighting, heavy dark decor. The kind of atmosphere that leans fully into the theme rather than being subtle about it, which honestly made it a fun spot to spend an evening with friends. That particular blend of genuinely spooky and knowingly theatrical that a lot of the older bars in that part of New Orleans do so well. I had gone out that night with a group of friends, and since parking anywhere near the French Quarter is always a nightmare, an ongoing struggle of circling block after block hoping for a spot to open up, I had ended up parking my truck illegally, about 2 blocks away from the bar itself, figuring I would deal with the consequences later if it came to that. I could still see the truck from inside through one of the windows, so I figured I would keep half an eye on it throughout the night and deal with moving it if I needed to, glancing over every so often between conversations and rounds of drinks just to make sure it was still sitting there undisturbed. At some point during the evening, someone pulled out of a legal parking spot a little closer to the bar, and I noticed the open space right away since I had been half watching that street the whole time, glancing over out of habit more than any real concern. I told everyone at the table I would be right back, that I was just going to run down and move my truck into that newly freed up legal spot before someone else grabbed it, or before I ended up with a ticket, or worse, a tow, sitting illegally parked for the rest of the night while we kept drinking inside. Nobody thought much of it. It was a quick errand, the kind of thing you do without a second thought on a night out, and I figured I would be back at the table again within a few minutes, drinks still cold, conversation barely interrupted. I stepped outside and started making my way down the street toward where my truck was parked. The French Quarter at night has its own particular atmosphere, especially once you get a couple of blocks away from the main strip of bars and restaurants, where the noise and lights start to fade behind you and the streets get quieter, older, more shadowed, lined with balconies and iron railings that seem to lean in a little closer overhead the further you get from the busier corners. That night in particular, there was a damp mist hanging low over everything. The kind of humid haze that part of the country gets so often, thick enough to blur the streetlights into soft halos and make the whole street feel a little unreal. A little removed from the busy energy of the bars just a couple of blocks behind me. It was the sort of atmosphere that would have made a great scene in a movie, honestly. Cobblestones slick with moisture, street lamps glowing fuzzy through the haze, everything just a little muffled and soft around the edges. The street itself was completely empty. Not a single other person in sight. No cars passing. Nothing but the wet pavement, the mist and the muffled, distant sound of music and voices drifting from the bars back behind me, growing fainter with every step I took further away from them. I was maybe halfway to my truck, walking at a normal pace, not thinking about much beyond getting there and back before my friends started wondering where I had gone, my mind mostly occupied with whether I would need to feed a meter or just how quickly I could get back inside before my drink went warm, when I heard a sound that immediately caught my attention. A metallic sound, distinct and unmistakable, something like the jingling clink of a chain moving. The kind of sound you would associate with metal links striking against each other rhythmically, in time with someone's footsteps, sharp and clear against the otherwise total silence of that empty, misty street. I turned my head to the right, toward where the sound seemed to be coming from, and that was when I saw him. A short man, I would guess around 5 feet tall at most, standing so close to me that he was literally within arm's reach. Close enough that under any normal circumstances, I absolutely should have noticed him there already, should have heard him approaching, should have had some warning of another person being that near to me on an otherwise completely empty street. My whole body reacted before my mind fully caught up, that instinctive jolt of surprise that comes from suddenly realizing someone is standing far closer to you than you expected. But there he was, right beside me, and he was already walking away, moving in the opposite direction, back toward the bar I had just come from, his pace steady and unhurried, as though nothing about the moment struck him as unusual at all. He had some kind of wallet chain hanging from his belt, the source of that metallic clinking sound I had heard, swinging slightly with each and every step he took, catching just enough of the streetlight through the mist for me to make out the glint of metal. And he appeared to be wearing spurs, the kind you would associate with old Western boots, something that seemed like an unusual, almost theatrical detail for someone walking around the French Quarter at night, though admittedly that particular neighborhood does draw its fair share of unusual characters in unusual outfits, especially late at night. when the line between costume and everyday wear tends to blur a little more than it would anywhere else. What genuinely unsettled me, and still unsettles me every time I think back on it, was the positioning of everything. He was walking away from me, back toward the direction of the bar, in a manner that made it look exactly as though he had been walking toward me, had passed directly by me, and was now continuing on his way in the opposite direction. Exactly the way two strangers might pass each other on any ordinary sidewalk, which would have been a completely mundane thing to witness. Two strangers passing each other on a sidewalk at night, except for one glaring problem that I could not get past no matter how many times I replayed it in my head. I would have had to have seen him coming. There was no way on that empty, misty street, with nothing but open sidewalk stretching out ahead of me for the entire length of the block, that a short man wearing spurs and a jingling wallet chain could have approached me, walked directly past me, and ended up on the opposite side of me, all without me ever once noticing him coming. It was like he had simply materialized out of nowhere, appearing directly beside me in the exact instant that metallic chain sound reached my ears. Already in the process of walking away as though he had always been there, as though the entire sequence of him approaching and passing me had happened, except somehow without me ever perceiving any part of it until the very last second, right as he was already moving past. That chain sound serving as the only warning I got of his presence at all, arriving at the same instant he was already leaving rather than announcing his approach the way it should have. I stood there for just a moment, processing what I had just seen, my brain scrambling to come up with some rational explanation. Maybe he had been standing in a doorway or some recessed entrance along the street that I simply had not noticed. Maybe the mist had somehow obscured him just enough that I missed him approaching. Maybe my own thoughts had simply been elsewhere, and I had genuinely failed to notice another person on an otherwise completely empty street. I ran through each of these possibilities one by one, standing there in the mist, and none of them sat right with me, even as I reached for them, especially given how close he had been, well within arm's reach, close enough that noticing him should have been unavoidable, regardless of how distracted I might have been. There simply had not been anywhere for him to have been standing. No recessed doorways along that stretch that I could recall. No parked vehicles large enough to conceal the person. Nothing at all along that particular section of sidewalk that could have hidden him from view until the exact moment he was already stepping past me. I did not say anything to him, and he did not say anything to me. He simply kept walking, that metallic clinking sound of his wallet chain and the faint scuff of his spurs against the wet pavement fading behind me as he continued back in the direction of the bar, the sound growing quieter and quieter until it disappeared entirely into the mist and the distant hum of music. I turned back around and kept walking myself toward my truck, trying not to dwell too hard on what had just happened, telling myself I would think it over more once I was safely back inside with my friends and a drink in my hand, my pulse still not quite back to its normal rhythm. I reached my truck without any further incident, moved it into that legal parking spot exactly as I had originally planned, taking a little longer than usual to actually park it properly since my hands were still not entirely steady, and made my way back to the bar. The walk back covered the exact same stretch of misty, empty street, and I found myself glancing around more carefully than I had on the way there, checking every doorway and shadowed alcove along the block, half expecting to encounter that same short man again, or something else equally unexplainable, but the street remained just as empty and quiet as it had been before. Nothing but mist and wet pavement, and the distant sound of music growing louder as I got closer to the bar again. I remember walking a little faster than necessary on that return trip, not quite running, but definitely not lingering either, eager to get back into the noise and light of the bar and away from that quiet, empty stretch of street. Nothing else happened for the rest of that night, thankfully. I made it back inside, rejoined my friends at the table, and eventually told them what had happened on my walk to move the truck, though I remember feeling a little sheepish describing it, aware of exactly how it sounded, a short man in spurs appearing out of thin air on an empty street. I kept waiting for someone to laugh at me outright, and a couple of my friends did, chalking it up to the mist playing tricks on my eyes, or maybe one too many drinks clouding my perception of how far away he had actually been when I first spotted him, teasing me a little about letting the bar's whole spooky theme get into my head. But a couple of others took it more seriously, especially given where we were, leaning in a little closer as I told it, asking follow-up questions about exactly how close he had been and which direction he had gone. The French Quarter is not exactly short on ghost stories and local legends. Entire walking tours built around the neighborhood's long, layered history of death, disease, fires, and everything else that has happened in that part of the city over the centuries. And more than one of my friends that night could rattle off at least one similar story they had heard from someone else who had spent enough time wandering those same old streets late at night. Given that context, a story about someone or something appearing out of nowhere on a quiet side street at night did not feel quite as out of place there as it might have felt anywhere else. I have thought about that encounter more than just a few times since that night, turning it over and over again in my head, trying to settle on some explanation that actually makes sense. I keep coming back to the same sticking point every time. The street was empty. I would have seen him coming. There was no alley, no recessed doorway, no parked car large enough to hide behind that I can recall being positioned anywhere close enough to explain him simply stepping out at the last second without me noticing. I have walked that same stretch of street plenty of times since, in daylight and at night both, deliberately looking for anything I might have missed that night. Any gap or alcove or shadowed entryway that could account for where he might have come from, and I have never found anything convincing. He was just there, suddenly, right beside me, already in the process of walking past, as though the entire approach had happened in some gap of time or perception I never actually experienced. I do not know if I fully believe in ghosts in any kind of concrete or philosophical sense, but I know what it felt like to have that man appear beside me the way he did, and I know that the whole scene played out exactly like something pulled directly from a ghost story or a vampire movie. The kind of moody, atmospheric encounter you would expect to see dramatized on screen rather than actually. Experience yourself on an ordinary night out with friends. The mist, the empty street, the metallic sound of that chain arriving a half second before I actually saw him, the impossible positioning of him already walking away when logically he should have still been approaching from somewhere ahead of me. All of it combined into an experience that has stuck with me far longer than I expected a single strange sidewalk encounter to stick with anyone. I even went looking online afterward, out of pure curiosity, trying to see if anyone else had ever reported anything similar in that same part of the French Quarter. A short figure appearing suddenly on a quiet street, wearing an outfit with a wallet chain and spurs, anything that might match what I had experienced that night. I found plenty of general ghost stories tied to that neighborhood. The usual accounts of shadowy figures glimpsed in old buildings, footsteps heard on empty staircases, cold spots reported in certain rooms of certain historic properties, but nothing that specifically matched the particular details of what I saw. The height, the outfit, that unmistakable metallic chain sound. It left me with the strange, slightly unsettling feeling of having experienced something that was mine alone, not part of some well-documented local legend that other people could point to and say, ah yes, that is the ghost everyone talks about on that street. Whatever or whoever that short man was, he did not seem to fit into any of the existing stories I could find, which somehow made the whole thing feel even less explainable than if I had simply stumbled into some well-known haunting everyone in the neighborhood already knew about. I have gone back to that same bar a handful of times since that night, and every single time I visit, I find myself glancing down that same stretch of street whenever I happen to walk past it, half out of curiosity and half out of some lingering unease, wondering if I might catch even the faintest glimpse of that same short man again. Wallet chain jingling, spurs scraping softly against the pavement, walking some endless loop between that bar and wherever it is he actually came from that night. Sometimes I even find myself timing my visits to that bar just a little differently than I used to, making sure I never have to walk down that particular stretch alone late at night if I can help it. Always finding some excuse to have a friend tag along with me if I need to step outside for any reason at all. It probably says something about how deeply that single encounter has lodged itself in my memory. The fact that years later, I am still quietly rearranging small habits around avoiding a repeat of that same walk. So far, nothing like that has happened again, and I am honestly not sure whether I am relieved or disappointed by that fact. Part of me wants an explanation badly enough that I would almost welcome seeing him again, just for the chance to actually get a better look, to ask him something, anything, that might finally make sense of what happened that night. And another part of me is deeply and genuinely grateful that whatever that was, it seems content to have shown itself just that once, briefly, impossibly, and then let me go on with the rest of my night undisturbed. Either way, I have never quite been able to shake the memory of standing there in that mist, watching a man who could not possibly have approached me the way he did, already walking calmly away, as though nothing unusual had happened at all, that metallic chain fading into the fog behind him like it had never been there in the first place. I was homeschooled growing up, and on top of that, my family moved around a lot, so I never really had the chance to put down roots anywhere or build the kind of long-term friendships most people take for granted from childhood. Every time I started to feel comfortable somewhere, to recognize the same faces at the library or the park or wherever we happened to be attending some homeschool group activity that month, it seemed like we would pack up and move again, starting the whole process over in some new town, some new state, sometimes even a completely different part of the country. I did not really know people outside of my immediate family, and even within my own family, I would say I barely knew them in any deep sense. Given how much time we spent in transition, packing up one life and starting another somewhere new, everyone a little too focused on logistics and adjustment to really sit still long enough to build the kind of closeness that comes from shared, stable routine. Because of all that moving and the isolation that came with being homeschooled without a steady community around me, I grew up with a somewhat unusual, sheltered understanding of how people were actually supposed to talk to each other, what normal social interaction looked like, and what red flags even were, since I simply had not been exposed to enough of it to build any kind of internal radar for when something felt genuinely wrong. When I finally got my first job at 16, it felt like a genuinely big step for me. My first real taste of being out in the world on my own, interacting with people my own age, in a setting that had nothing to do with my family. There was something exciting about clocking in and being treated like a semi-independent person for the first time in my life, having coworkers instead of siblings, having a schedule that was mine rather than something built around the whole family's needs. It was there that I met a guy who was 18 at the time, a couple years older than me, who seemed very sweet when I first got to know him. He was easy to talk to, seemed friendly and interested in getting to know me, asking questions about my life, my interests, seeming genuinely curious in a way that felt flattering to someone who had spent so little time around people her own age. Given how little experience I had with people outside my own household, I did not have much of a baseline to compare him against. He was just one of the first people my own age I had really talked to at length, and at first, everything about him seemed perfectly fine. Maybe even a little exciting, a genuine friendship forming in a way I had rarely gotten to experience before. As I got to know him better, we started hanging out one-on-one, just the two of us, spending time together the way new friends, or maybe something slightly more than friends, sometimes do. Meeting up after shifts, texting back and forth, the ordinary rhythm of a new friendship taking shape. It did not take long before I started noticing things about him that, looking back now with the benefit of years, and a much better understanding of what healthy behavior actually looks like, were clear warning signs. At the time, though, I genuinely did not have the tools to recognize them for what they were. I was young, naive, and I had spent my entire life up to that point with almost no real exposure to how people outside my family actually communicated with each other. So when he said or did things that should have alarmed me, my brain simply filed them away as though this must be normal, since I had nothing else to measure it against. No other 18-year-old guy's behavior to compare it to. Nothing that told me this was anything other than how people my age simply talk to each other. A couple of times, we would sit around together and smoke weed, and I would end up completely zonked out. My mind slow and hazy in that particular way marijuana affects some people, barely able to keep up with the conversation, let alone critically analyze it. During those sessions, he would go off on these long tangents, rambling in a way that started innocuously enough, but would slowly drift into something much darker. He would say things like how he would never kill anyone, but if he did. And then he would proceed to actually walk through, in detail, exactly how he would go about doing it, describing it with a kind of casual, matter-of-fact tone that in hindsight should have been far more alarming than it registered as at the time. I want to be honest and say that I barely remember most of what he said during these tangents because I was so out of it at the time. My mind drifting in and out, half tuning him out the way you do when someone is rambling and you are too high to really engage, thinking something along the lines of, "Sure, buddy, whatever you say," without ever really registering the full weight of what he was describing. My attention drifting to the music playing in the background, or whatever else was happening in the room, rather than staying, locked on to the actual content of what he was telling me. But there are a couple of specific details from those conversations that have stuck with me clearly, even all these years later, details that I did not fully process as disturbing in the moment, but that have crystallized into something genuinely unsettling every time I think back on them now. He specifically emphasized, more than once, across more than one of these hazy tangents, that if he were to do something like that, he would want the victim to be a woman, never a man, always specifically a woman. A detail he repeated with a kind of consistency that suggests it was not just some passing thought, but something he had actually settled on. And he went into detail about how he would want her looking directly into his eyes while he did it, describing wanting her to look at him the way you might look at God, some kind of ultimate authority or power in that final moment. A comparison strange and specific enough that it has never fully left my memory the way so much of the rest of what he said has. I remember that detail specifically because of how strange and particular it was. The kind of detail that does not come from idle rambling, but from something someone has actually sat with and thought through carefully, turning it over in their mind enough times to arrive at that particular image and hold on to it with a clarity that suggested real rehearsal rather than a spur-of-the-moment thought. At the time, high and inexperienced and genuinely unable to parse just how alarming that kind of statement should have been, I let it slide past me the same way I let most of his rambling slide past me, filing it under the vague category of him just being weird sometimes. The kind of thing you write off when you do not yet understand that some warning signs are not meant to be written off at all, no matter how casually they happen to be delivered. Eventually, for reasons that had nothing directly to do with those specific conversations at the time, since I still had not fully processed how disturbing they actually were, I stopped hanging out with him. Our friendship, or whatever it had been, simply fizzled out the way these things sometimes do among teenagers. Without any dramatic falling out or confrontation on my end, just a slow drifting apart that felt at the time like nothing more than two people growing in different directions, rather than any kind of deliberate escape from something dangerous. What happened next is where things took an entirely different and honestly infuriating turn. After I stopped spending time with him, he started going around telling mutual friends of ours that I had made false accusations against him, specifically that I was going around claiming he had raped me. I want to be completely clear about this, because it matters enormously to the whole story. I never said anything of the sort. The thought had genuinely never even crossed my mind. Nothing like that had happened between us, and I had never once accused him of anything to anyone. Not to a friend, not to a family member, not to a single soul. He simply invented this claim out of nowhere and started spreading it to people we both knew, painting himself as the victim of some fabricated accusation that existed only in his own imagination. One that he apparently constructed entirely on his own, without a single word of provocation from me at any point. I found out about this secondhand, the way these things usually surface, through a handful of different mutual friends who separately came to me over the following weeks, each of them mentioning that he had been telling people I was crazy, that I was out there accusing him of rape. Hearing this from multiple different people, all independently confirming the same story without any of them apparently comparing notes with each other beforehand, made it clear this was not some single misunderstanding or one person's exaggeration getting passed around and distorted along the way. He was actively and repeatedly telling this fabricated story to people in our shared social circle, apparently trying to control the narrative and paint himself as the wronged party before I could ever say anything about him myself, even though I had no intention of saying anything at all, and honestly had no idea there was even anything to say beyond a vague sense of unease about some of our conversations. One night, not my proudest decision looking back on it now, I had been drinking, and in a moment of foolish, alcohol-fueled impulsiveness, I decided to reach out to him directly and ask him why he would do something like that, why he would invent and spread a story that had absolutely no basis in reality. I remember typing out the message with shaking hands, half expecting him to either deny the whole thing entirely or offer some flimsy excuse I could at least partially accept and move on from. His answer, when it finally came, was almost more unsettling to me than the accusation itself. He told me it was because he assumed that I would eventually accuse him of something like that myself. So he figured he would get ahead of it by spreading the story first, framing himself as the victim before I ever had the chance to say a word. I remember reading that response and feeling this strange, uncomfortable mix of disbelief and validation all at once. Disbelief, because the logic of it was so twisted. The idea that preemptively lying about someone somehow protects you from a lie they were never actually planning to tell in the first place. A kind of reasoning that only makes sense if you assume the absolute worst about another person, without any actual evidence to support it. And validation, in a strange, uncomfortable way, because it confirms something about his character that I had only half sensed during our friendship. Some deep undercurrent of paranoia or manipulation or genuine instability that I had not fully understood or named at the time, but that had clearly been there the whole time, simmering under the surface of every one of those conversations I had mostly tuned out. Looking back on the whole situation now with years of distance and a much clearer understanding of red flags and manipulative behavior than I had at 16, I find myself replaying those hazy, half-remembered conversations from those nights we smoked together, trying to piece together everything he actually said, wondering how much more detail there might have been that I simply never processed because I was too high or too inexperienced to register the full weight of it in the moment. I wish, in some ways, that I had been paying closer attention, that I had asked follow-up questions or pushed back in the moment rather than simply letting it wash over me the way I did. Though I also recognize that at 16, hazy from marijuana, and completely unequipped to recognize the seriousness of what I was hearing, there was probably very little chance I would have reacted any differently, even if I had been paying closer attention. It unsettles me now in a way it genuinely did not at the time, precisely because I did not have the context back then to understand just how seriously those kinds of statements should be taken, especially from someone specifically choosing to share them with someone younger, someone more naive, someone less likely to immediately recognize them for the warning signs they actually were. I think about how isolated I was growing up, moving constantly, homeschooled, without the normal social exposure most people get through years of school, sports, sleepovers, all those ordinary childhood experiences that teach you, almost by osmosis, what normal interaction looks like and what crosses a line. Without that foundation, I walked into my very first real friendship outside my immediate family with essentially no framework for identifying danger. No internal alarm bells calibrated by years of comparison against other, healthier relationships. He got, in some sense, the perfect audience for whatever it was he needed to say out loud during those hazy, weed smoke-filled evenings. Someone young enough and inexperienced enough to simply let it wash over her without fully registering how alarming it should have been. Someone who had no older siblings, friends, or classmates' stories to compare his behavior against. Nothing to tell her that this was not just how 18-year-old guys talked when they trusted you enough to open up. I do not know, to this day, whether any of what he described to me during those tangents about wanting a woman to look at him a certain way while he hurt her was ever anything more than dark, idle fantasy. The kind of disturbing thoughts some people apparently have and never act on in their entire lives. I have no way of knowing what he has done or not done in the years since we stopped talking, whether those tangents were simply the product of a troubled young mind working through something that never went any further than words shared with an unsuspecting 16-year-old, or whether they represented something closer to an actual plan, rehearsed out loud in front of someone he correctly assessed would be too naive and too hazy from the marijuana to fully absorb what he was telling her. What I do know is that the entire situation, the strange, unsettling monologues about violence directed specifically at women, followed immediately by his own bizarre, preemptive campaign to paint himself as a victim of accusations that existed only in his own head, paints a picture of someone who was, at minimum, deeply unwell, and at worst, something considerably more dangerous than unwell. I am genuinely grateful, looking back, that whatever those late-night tangents actually represented, they never turned into anything directed at me, personally. I got out of that friendship, if it can even be called that, with nothing more than an uncomfortable memory and a strange, half-formed story about false accusations that never happened, rather than anything worse actually happening to me, And I try to remind myself of that whenever the memory of those conversations resurfaces and threatens to spiral into something heavier than I want to carry around with me on any given day. But I have never fully shaken the memory of him describing, in that oddly specific detail, exactly how he wanted a woman to look at him in that final moment, as though he were God to her. It is the kind of detail that does not fade the way most hazy, half-remembered conversations from your teenage years tend to fade over time. If anything, it has only grown more vivid and more unsettling to me the further away I get from that period of my life, the more context and life experience I accumulate that lets me finally understand, all these years later, exactly how seriously I should have taken every single word. Looking back now, I try to take something useful away from the whole experience rather than just carrying around the unease of it forever. I have become, if nothing else, far more attuned to the way people talk when something is genuinely wrong beneath the surface. Far quicker to notice when someone's casual tone does not match the darkness of what they are actually describing to you. I do not know whatever became of him after we lost contact for good, whether he ever got any kind of help for whatever was going on in his mind during those years, or whether those conversations were simply a strange, isolated chapter of his life that never repeated itself with anyone else who crossed his path afterward. I hope, for the sake of whoever might have crossed his path after me, that it was the former rather than the latter, that he got help and moved past whatever was happening in his mind during that period, though I have no way of ever knowing for certain, and that uncertainty is its own quiet, lingering discomfort that I suspect will never fully go away, no matter how much time passes. This one did not happen to me directly, but it happened to my older cousin, someone I am very close to and have no reason to doubt. She has never been the type to exaggerate or dramatize things for effect. If anything, she tends to underplay strange or unsettling experiences rather than build them up dramatically, which is part of why this particular story has stuck with me so strongly since she first told it to me in detail. Some time ago, she went to a house party being hosted by a friend of hers. One of those casual weekend gatherings that starts small and grows as the evening goes on, more people trickling in as word spreads that something is happening. From what I understand, the party was made up mostly of a group of people who all knew each other in one capacity or another, running the full spectrum from close friends and family members to people who only knew of each other secondhand. Through mutual connections, rather than any real direct relationship of their own, the kind of loosely overlapping social circle that tends to form around one central host and their closest friends. Once the party started picking up, the kind of gathering where people were a few drinks in and starting to loosen up, relax into the evening, and get comfortable enough to suggest doing something a little different, the subject of playing some kind of game came up in conversation. Someone at the counter mentioning it half, jokingly at first, before the idea started to catch on with the rest of the room. Groups of people at parties like this often land on some activity to bring everyone together in one room. Cards, board games, something to break up the usual scattered mingling into a shared moment, everyone gravitating toward the kitchen or living room once the idea starts gaining momentum. During this particular round of brainstorming what to do, there was a woman present whom my cousin only knew very vaguely, someone on the outer edge of the friend group rather than a close connection. Someone my cousin might have exchanged a handful of words with in passing at previous gatherings, but never really gotten to know beyond that, who mentioned that she was into tarot card reading and offered to give readings to anyone interested in having one done. The suggestion was met with immediate enthusiasm from several people at the party. The kind of lighthearted curiosity that usually greets an offer like that at a gathering where everyone is a little buzzed and looking for something fun and slightly different to do together. Certain details from here get a little fuzzy in my retelling, since I am relaying this secondhand from what my cousin remembers and described to me. The natural blur that happens to memory once alcohol and time, and the sheer strangeness of what followed, all get layered on top of the earlier, more mundane parts of the evening. But the owner of the house, who was my cousin's actual close friend in the group, decided to take the woman up on her offer. A small group of people gathered around the kitchen table. Since that was where the woman had chosen to set up and do her readings, pulling out chairs and leaning in close, everyone curious and a little buzzed, treating the whole thing as a fun, lighthearted party activity rather than anything to take too seriously. The kind of thing you do at a party more for the novelty and the laughs than out of any genuine belief in what the cards might reveal. Apparently, things went completely normally at first. The reading started out sounding like the kind of general broad strokes content you might read on a zodiac chart in a magazine or scroll past online. The sort of vague, flattering, mildly insightful commentary that tarot readings at parties tend to offer. Entertaining without necessarily being unsettling. The kind of thing that gets a few laughs and a few knowing nods from people who feel like the description fits them well enough to be fun. Everyone seemed to be enjoying it, laughing along, treating it as harmless fun, exactly the kind of lighthearted party game everyone had expected when the idea first came up. Then, something changed. The woman doing the reading suddenly stopped talking about the usual zodiac-style material and began revealing very personal information about my cousin's friend, the homeowner, right there in front of everyone gathered at the table. Her tone shifting subtly along with the subject matter, growing more pointed and specific with every sentence. She started talking about things that had actually happened in this woman's life. Specific details that my cousin assumed had to be genuinely private, even dark secrets, based purely on the reaction they were provoking. Details far too precise and far too personal to be explained away as generic tarot language that could apply to anyone. The more the tarot reader revealed, the angrier and more visibly distressed the homeowner became, her composure slipping further with every new detail the woman brought up in front of the entire gathered group, her face going through a visible transformation from mild discomfort to genuine mounting panic. At one point, the homeowner started yelling at the reading woman to stop, becoming genuinely hysterical, her voice rising in a way that made it clear this had crossed from an entertaining party trick into something that felt like a real, painful violation. The kind of reaction that immediately silenced the rest of the room and made everyone realize this was no longer just a fun party game anyone was enjoying. And yet, the tarot reader just kept going, on and on, seemingly unable or unwilling to stop, looking as though something had taken hold of her, some force compelling her to keep revealing this other woman's private business, regardless of how much distress it was clearly causing. My cousin described the woman's expression during all of this as strange, distant, almost as though she were not fully present or in control of what she was saying, simply channeling whatever it was that kept pouring out of her voice steady, and even as the homeowner's own voice climbed higher and higher into genuine hysteria. Finally, unable to take any more of it, the homeowner got up and left the kitchen entirely, needing to physically remove herself from the situation. At this point, the tarot reader stopped talking, but she still seemed somewhere else mentally, sitting completely still at the table, staring straight ahead at nothing in particular, not engaging with anyone else still sitting there, not seeming to register that the person she had been reading for had just fled the room in obvious distress, while everyone else remaining in the kitchen was still trying to process what had just happened, still exchanging confused, uneasy glances with each other. Nobody quite sure what the right response even was to something that strange, the homeowner came back into the room. This time, she was carrying a gun, and she pointed it directly at the tarot reader's face, demanding that the woman keep going, egging her on to continue revealing whatever dark secrets she had been uncovering only minutes earlier, now doing so under the explicit threat of being shot if she dared to comply, her hands visibly shaking with rage and adrenaline as she held the weapon steady. Understandably, at this point, some people at the party immediately started making their way toward the door, wanting no part of whatever was unfolding in that kitchen, grabbing coats and phones and heading for the exit without waiting to see how the situation would resolve. A few others tried to talk the homeowner down, attempting to de-escalate the situation, urging her to put the weapon away before things went any further, their voices low and careful the way you speak to someone you are genuinely afraid might do something irreversible in the next few seconds. But even with a gun now pointed directly at her face, the tarot reader did not react at all. She simply sat there, still as stone, her face completely expressionless, showing no fear, no pleading, nothing that would suggest she was even fully processing the danger she was supposedly in, an eerie stillness that unsettled the room almost as much as the gun itself. It was right around this point that things took an even stranger turn. The lights throughout the house began flickering, on and off, in a way that made no sense given the conditions outside. It was a clear night, nothing like an approaching thunderstorm or any kind of weather event that might explain a power fluctuation. Nothing that could account for the lights behaving the way they suddenly started to. No wind, no storm. Not even a hint of bad weather that might have offered some kind of ordinary explanation. Just as this flickering began, the homeowner's dog, a large but consistently well-behaved and friendly Rottweiler, who had been lying quietly in his usual spot on the floor throughout the entire party up to this point, completely unbothered by any of the earlier drama, the yelling, or even the gun, suddenly got up and became visibly agitated. He started barking, loudly and insistently, not at any of the people present in the room, but down a hallway leading off from the kitchen, a hallway where absolutely nobody from the party was standing, his whole body tense and alert in a way nobody had ever seen from him before. Even though the lights throughout the house were flickering at this point, every single light in the house, including the one in that particular hallway, was on and working, meaning there should have been nothing obscured or hidden in the shadows down that corridor to explain the dog's sudden, intense reaction toward an apparently empty space. My cousin told me that right around this same moment, she looked toward that hallway herself and saw a huge, shapeless shadow move quickly out of it, sweeping through the kitchen in one fluid, silent motion and out through the front entryway of the house entirely. Gone as quickly as it had appeared, leaving nothing behind but a room full of stunned, frightened people and a dog still barking at empty space. That was the moment my cousin decided she had seen enough and needed to leave immediately, not willing to spend another second inside that house after witnessing that shadow move the way it had. She called her husband to come pick her up, and she told me she waited outside on the curb the entire time until he arrived, refusing to go back inside for even a moment, not to grab a forgotten jacket, not to say a proper goodbye to her friend, nothing, regardless of what might still be happening within its walls while she stood there in the dark waiting for him to show up. Apparently, at some point after she left, things must have calmed down somewhat back inside the house, because my cousin mentioned that her friend, the very same woman who had been holding a gun to someone's face only a short while earlier, started trying to coax people back inside, including my cousin and others who were either already standing outside or in the process of leaving entirely. She kept assuring everyone, standing in the doorway, calling out to the small cluster of people gathered on the lawn and along the curb, that she was not going to hurt anybody, that whatever had happened had passed. Trying to convince people it was safe to come back in and continue the party as though nothing unusual had occurred, her tone almost pleading by that point. Unsurprisingly, given everything that had just unfolded in that kitchen, nobody took her up on that offer. The party, for all practical purposes, ended right there on the curb outside, with people scattering to their cars or waiting for rides rather than risking another moment inside that house. Small clusters of shaken guests standing under the streetlights, comparing notes on what they had each just witnessed. My cousin told me that in the days and weeks following that party, the friend group never quite recovered its previous shape. Several people who had been at the house that night simply stopped attending gatherings hosted by the homeowner altogether, quietly drifting away without ever fully explaining why to anyone who had not been present themselves. The homeowner herself apparently tried, more than once, to smooth things over, reaching out individually to people who had left that night, downplaying what had happened, framing it as an overreaction born out of alcohol, and an unexpectedly intense reading rather than anything that should have actually frightened anyone as badly as it clearly had. My cousin told me she accepted a couple of these overtures out of a sense of long-standing loyalty to the friendship, agreeing to get coffee or meet up one-on-one, but she never went back to that particular house again. And she never sat anywhere near another tarot reading, no matter how casually it was suggested at any gathering since. As for the woman who had done the reading, my cousin lost track of her entirely after that night, never hearing her name mentioned again in any context. She was not a close enough part of the friend group for anyone to really keep tabs on her afterward, and as far as my cousin knows, she never showed up at another gathering with that same circle of people again, vanishing from the group as abruptly and completely as whatever that shadow in the hallway had been. I have thought about this story often since my cousin first told it to me, replaying the details in my own head the way you do with any story that genuinely unsettles you, trying to make sense of the sequence of events, the sudden shift from harmless zodiac talk to something far more invasive. The gun, the flickering lights, that shadow moving through the kitchen. I have never fully landed on an explanation that satisfies me, and I suspect I never will. But that uncertainty itself feels like part of the point. Some experiences resist tidy explanation, and this one, secondhand as it is to me, has always struck me as exactly that kind of story. One that leaves you with more questions than answers, no matter how many times you turn it over in your mind. Now, I want to be very clear about something before wrapping this story up, because I think it matters given the subject matter involved. In spite of my own personal faith and beliefs, I am not the type of person who instantly demonizes things like tarot cards, divination, or any other similar practice as inherently evil or somehow automatically tied to malevolent forces, the way I know some people within certain religious communities are quick to do. I actually have genuine respect for these kinds of practices and belief systems, and I recognize and admire the often overlooked and somewhat forgotten history these traditions share with certain strands of Christianity itself, historical overlaps that get erased in a lot of modern conversations that want to paint everything outside a very narrow definition of acceptable religious practice as automatically dangerous or forbidden. Conversations that flatten a much richer and more complicated shared history into something far simpler and less generous than it actually is. So I want to be upfront that I do not intend for this story to serve as some blanket condemnation of tarot reading as a practice, and I would genuinely hate for anyone hearing it to walk away with that impression, since that is not the point I am trying to make at all. That said, as my cousin told me this story, sitting across from me, clearly still shaken by it, even with some time having passed since it happened, It was one of the very few times in our entire relationship that I have seen her genuinely, visibly afraid while recounting something. Her hands wrapped tightly around whatever drink she was holding, her voice dropping lower as she got to the parts about the shadow and the flickering lights. And based on her reaction alone, separate from any personal beliefs I hold about tarot reading itself, I believe that something genuinely dark happened in that house that night, and that my cousin witnessed real evidence of it firsthand, whatever the ultimate source or explanation for it might have been. I do strongly believe, thinking it over in the time since she told me all of this, that sometimes attempting to tap into forces you do not fully understand or properly respect, even in the context of what feels like a harmless little party game or lighthearted ritual, can open a door to something else entirely. Some kind of mischief or genuine darkness that seizes the opportunity presented to it, wreaking whatever havoc it can manage before eventually being forced back behind whatever veil normally keeps it separate from the rest of us. Whether that force found its way in through the tarot reading itself, through whatever raw nerve got struck the moment those secrets started spilling out in front of a room full of people, through the sheer intensity of the emotions running through that kitchen once the gun came out, or through something else entirely that none of us will ever fully understand, I cannot say for certain. But I know my cousin left that house that night, convinced she had witnessed something far beyond an ordinary, if dramatic, argument between two friends, and knowing her as well as I do, having watched her navigate plenty of other difficult and dramatic situations over the years without ever reacting quite like this, I am inclined to believe her completely. I used to attend a summer day camp when I was a kid, and once a year the camp would put on a special overnight event, letting the campers stay through the night on the grounds instead of going home like usual, which was always treated as a huge deal among the kids attending. The one single night out of the whole summer that everyone looked forward to and talked about for weeks in advance, counting down the days on whatever calendar they kept at home. This particular summer was my very first year at this camp, since we had recently moved to the area, which meant I did not know any of the local lore or traditions that the returning campers had already absorbed from previous years. The inside jokes and shared history that comes naturally to kids who have been going to the same place summer after summer, watching the same rituals repeat themselves year after year until they feel like a permanent part of the camp's identity. I was 12 years old at the time, old enough to be excited about staying overnight away from my parents for the first time in that kind of group setting, but still young enough that I had no real context for what an overnight at this specific camp actually involved beyond the basics anyone had told me. The vague promise of a campfire and some kind of special evening activity that nobody had bothered to explain in any real detail beforehand. As the evening wore on and it got closer and closer to full dark, the counselors started setting up the campfire, the traditional centerpiece of these overnight events, where all the campers would eventually gather together to sing songs, roast marshmallows, and listen to whatever stories or traditions the staff had planned for that particular night. While the fire was still being built up and things had not officially started yet, I found myself off near the edge of the woods bordering the camp property, chatting with a friend I had made earlier that summer. The two of us just talking about whatever random things kids talk about while waiting for something more organized to begin. It was during this casual conversation, standing there near the tree line with the fire crackling to life somewhere behind us, the smell of the first bit of wood smoke just starting to drift over toward us, that I was suddenly interrupted by something moving in the woods just ahead of us. Two small points of blue light, flying slowly, at what I distinctly remember being exactly eye level for me at the time, moving parallel to the ground rather than darting around erratically the way insects typically do, and positioned exactly the width of a person's eyes apart from each other, side by side, moving in unison as though somehow tethered together. It struck me immediately as strange, unlike anything I had seen before, even though my first instinct was to assume they were simply fireflies, since that would have been the most obvious and reasonable explanation for two small glowing lights appearing in the woods at night, and fireflies were common enough around that part of the property that seeing a couple lighting up after dusk was nothing unusual in itself. I pointed it out excitedly to my friend, wanting her to see this odd, glowing pair of lights moving together in that unusual, deliberate way, tugging at her sleeve and pointing toward the spot in the trees where I had just seen them. But by the time she actually turned her head to look in the direction I was pointing, the lights were already gone, vanished from view entirely, leaving nothing behind in the dark space between the trees where they had been floating only a second earlier. She had missed it completely, and since I could not really describe it in a way that conveyed just how strange the movement itself had been without her having actually witnessed it herself, we mostly just shrugged it off and went back to our conversation. Chalking it up to some quirk of local firefly behavior neither of us had ever specifically noticed before, the kind of small, forgettable oddity you brush off within a few minutes at that age. The evening continued on as planned. Eventually, all of the campers were called over to gather around the now fully built and blazing campfire, settling into the usual circle formation. Sitting on logs and blankets spread out on the ground, the smell of wood smoke thick in the air as marshmallows got passed around, and someone started leading a round of familiar camp songs. It was a fun, lively atmosphere for most of the evening, exactly the kind of overnight experience I had been looking forward to, full of laughter and the usual good-natured chaos of a large group of kids staying up later than they normally would, singing along to songs I was hearing for the first time, but quickly picked up thanks to the repeated choruses. I remember feeling, for that stretch of the night, completely at ease, fully absorbed in the fun of the evening, and having entirely forgotten about the strange lights I had seen earlier near the tree line. My earlier unease from that brief encounter dissolving completely into the warmth and noise of the fire and the company of the other kids around me. But later, as the evening wound down and the campfire itself began to burn lower, closer to the very end of the planned activities for the night, one of the counselors stood up, called for quiet, and asked for everyone's attention, explaining that this particular closing tradition happened every single year at the end of the overnight campfire. A moment the returning campers seemed to already recognize immediately, several of them sitting up a little straighter and going quiet in a way that told me this was clearly a well-established, anticipated part of the evening for anyone who had been to this camp before. The counselor then told the story of a child who had died at that very camp years earlier, well before any of us current campers had ever attended, his voice dropping into a slower, more solemn tone than he had used for any of the songs or lighter stories earlier in the night. According to the counselor, this was not some invented ghost story meant simply to entertain or scare the kids, but an actual, real historical tragedy tied specifically to the camp's own history. Something the staff took seriously enough to treat with genuine respect rather than pure campfire theatrics. The child in question had been dragged by a horse in some kind of accident on the property, resulting in his death, and the counselor explained that the staff made a point of honoring his memory at the end of every overnight campfire, as a kind of long-standing tradition passed down through generations of camp staff and returning campers. A small moment of remembrance built permanently into the structure of the night. As part of telling this story, the counselor mentioned something that immediately sent a jolt of ice-cold recognition straight through me. People who spent time at the camp, particularly out near the edges of the woods bordering the property, would sometimes report seeing this child's bright blue eyes glowing out from among the trees at night. The counselor was quick to reassure everyone gathered around the fire that this was considered a friendly spirit, not something to be afraid of, framing the sighting as a kind of gentle, protective presence rather than anything sinister, part of the overall respectful, honoring tone the tradition was clearly meant to carry, even going so far as to say that seeing those eyes was considered something of a small honor, a sign that the spirit had chosen to reveal himself to you specifically. I sat there by that fire, listening to this story unfold, and I felt my stomach drop as the pieces started clicking together in my head all at once. Two glowing points of light, exactly eye level, exactly eye width apart, moving slowly and deliberately through the woods earlier that same evening, right around the same spot near the tree line where my friend and I had been standing and talking before the fire had even started. What I had assumed, in the moment, to be nothing more than an unusually behaving pair of fireflies now sat in a completely different light entirely, given everything the counselor had just described about this child's spirit and his bright blue eyes supposedly appearing among those exact trees. I remember sitting there, completely rattled, my mind racing back through the details of what I had actually seen, trying to reconcile the rational explanation I had originally settled on with this sudden, unsettling new context the counselor's story had just provided. I did not say anything out loud to anyone else in that moment, too unsettled and honestly a little embarrassed to bring it up in front of a group of kids I had only just met that summer. But internally, I was completely and thoroughly freaked out, sitting perfectly still by the fire while everyone else around me had already moved on to talking quietly among themselves about the story. Some of the returning kids nodding along as though the tradition were entirely old news to them, something they had heard every single year without it ever losing its impact. I kept glancing sideways toward the same stretch of tree line where my friend and I had been standing earlier that evening, half expecting, half dreading, that I might catch another glimpse of those same two blue lights now that I understood what they might actually represent. That night itself, though, long before I ever got the chance to mention any of this to my parents, lying in my sleeping bag inside whatever cabin or tent arrangement the camp had set up for the overnight, listening to the quiet breathing and occasional shifting of the other kids around me already fast asleep, I could not fall asleep myself no matter how hard I tried. My mind kept replaying the image of those two blue lights over and over, parallel to the ground, exactly eye level, exactly eye width apart, moving with a strange, deliberate slowness that felt entirely unlike the erratic, darting flight pattern fireflies normally display, that image looping endlessly behind my closed eyes every time I tried to settle into sleep. I kept trying to talk myself down, reminding myself repeatedly that fireflies exist, that bioluminescent insects genuinely do produce that kind of blue-green glow, that there was nothing supernatural required to explain two small lights appearing in the woods at night, running through the logic again and again like a kind of mental checklist meant to calm myself down. But no matter how many times I ran through the rational explanation in my head, some small, persistent part of me could not fully shake the unsettling coincidence of the timing, the location, and the exact physical description matching so precisely with what the counselor had described only a couple hours later that same evening. And every time I got close to drifting off, that same nagging thought would jolt me back to full alertness again. I also remember, in the days following the overnight, once I was back home, mentioning the story to my parents almost as an afterthought while recounting the whole trip, telling them about the campfire and the songs and somewhat reluctantly about the ghost story and what I thought I had seen beforehand. My mother, practical as ever, told me it was almost certainly fireflies and nothing more. The same conclusion I had already mostly talked myself into, though she also admitted, with a small smile, that it was a genuinely good story, regardless of what had actually caused it. The kind of thing that made summer camp memorable in exactly the way it was supposed to be. I want to be very clear, even now, all these years later, that I genuinely do not believe in ghosts. I am not someone who walks around convinced that spirits linger in old buildings or haunt specific locations. And my rational adult brain has settled comfortably into the explanation that what I actually witnessed that night was simply two fireflies flying together in an unusually coordinated and strange way, close enough to each other and positioned at just the right height and distance apart that it created the illusion of eyes floating in the darkness, an illusion made all the more convincing by the way they seemed to bob very slightly as they moved, mimicking, in just enough of an eerie approximation, the kind of subtle movement you would expect from someone's actual eyes shifting their gaze while peering out from among the trees. I have even, in adulthood, looked up online whether fireflies are known to display any kind of paired or synchronized flight behavior, curious whether there might be some documented natural explanation for exactly the kind of pattern I remember witnessing that night, though I never came across anything definitive enough to fully settle the question either way, one way or the other. But even with that rational explanation firmly in place, even fully and genuinely believing it to be the true and correct answer, I still get creeped out every single time I think back on that night, no matter how many years have passed since it actually happened. There is something about the specific combination of details, the exact eye level height, the exact eye width spacing, the slow, deliberate, non-erratic movement, all of it happening in precisely the same spot where a supposedly friendly but very real childhood spirit was said to appear, only for that exact detail to be confirmed by a counselor's story mere hours after I had witnessed it firsthand with my own eyes. That has never quite let me fully relax about the whole experience, regardless of how confident I remain in the underlying rational explanation to this day. Looking back on it now, I think what makes this particular memory stick with me so persistently, far more than any other campfire ghost story I heard throughout the rest of my many years attending that camp, is the sheer specificity and timing of the coincidence itself. If I had simply heard the story about the boy and his bright blue eyes first, and then happened to see two ordinary fireflies drifting through the woods afterward, I doubt I would have thought twice about it, my imagination filling in whatever gaps it wanted to after already being primed by the story, the way ghost stories at camp always seem to make every rustling leaf and passing shadow feel significant for a night or two afterward. But the order of events happened the opposite way around. I saw those two strange, coordinated blue lights first, entirely unprompted by any story or context whatsoever, with absolutely no reason at that point to interpret them as anything other than an oddity of nature. And only afterward did the counselor's story arrive to retroactively reframe what I had witnessed into something that lined up, detail for detail, with a supposedly real, historically documented tragedy tied directly to that same patch of woods. I have gone back to visit that camp a couple of times over the years since, mostly just out of nostalgia, walking the same grounds as an adult now and seeing how much had changed and how much had somehow stayed exactly the same. The same old dining hall, the same lake down past the cabins, even some of the same worn wooden signs marking the trails through the woods. I have never once seen anything resembling those two blue lights again on any of those return visits over the years. Though admittedly, I have also never once gone wandering near that same tree line after dark since. Whether out of genuine lingering unease or simple, practical caution, I honestly could not tell you for certain even now. Some small part of me, even now, all these years later, prefers to leave well enough alone rather than deliberately go looking for a repeat encounter with whatever it actually was I saw that night. Content to let that particular memory stay exactly as unresolved as it has always been. I have told this story to a handful of people over the years, usually around campfires myself now, that I am the one telling stories to younger kids or my own friends, rather than sitting and listening to someone else's tale. The strange full circle of eventually becoming the storyteller myself at gatherings, not unlike the one where I first heard about that boy and his eyes all those years ago. The reactions tend to follow a pretty predictable pattern every single time I share it. Most people, hearing the story laid out logically from start to finish, land exactly where I do. Firmly convinced it was almost certainly nothing more than an unusual firefly encounter, amplified into something far spookier than it actually was by the timing of the counselor's story arriving so soon afterward. But there's always a moment, every single time I tell it, where I can see a flicker of genuine unease cross someone's face as I describe the specific detail of the eye level height and the eye width spacing. A detail that objectively should not matter if it really was just fireflies moving randomly through the dark, but that somehow always manages to land with a little more weight than the rest of the story, precisely because it lines up so exactly, so specifically, with the idea of a pair of eyes staring back at you from somewhere in the trees, watching quietly from just beyond the edge of the firelight.